Hi, everybody. Tonight we're going to drift gently into a world that feels almost like a dream, a world lit by flickering candlelight, echoing with soft footsteps on cold stone and perfumed with the earthy scent of herbs, parchment, and worn leather. A world where time moved slower and knowledge was passed from hand to hand like sacred relics. This is the world of medieval medicine. Our story unfolds behind the wooden doors of monasteries and dusty apothecaries, and through crowded market squares and quiet village paths, where doctors move silently, learned, weary, and sometimes a little desperate. Tonight, we're going to ask a question, one that sounds simple but isn't. What did medieval doctors actually do all day? Let's begin. In the earliest rays of morning, long before the streets of the city awoke with life, the medieval doctor had already stirred. Their days began not with action, but with stillness. Silence was a sacred ally. They sat beside a small writing desk, a place worn smooth by years of use. The flicker of a tallow candle was often the only light, painting shifting shadows on the walls and across the pages of a worn, hand-copied text, perhaps Galen or Hippocrates, or maybe something more recent, like the writings of Avicenna. There was a reverence to the way they approached their work, a belief that medicine was not only science, but also philosophy and faith. The doctor's day did not start with hurried rounds or bustling patients, but with reading, reflection, with the ancient belief that the body's health reflected the balance of four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medicine was a poetic, interpretive art. If a patient suffered from melancholy, the doctor might attribute it to an excess of black bile and prescribe something warming and dry, like rosemary or wine steeped with herbs. But this knowledge didn't come from guesswork. It came from books, carefully guarded books copied by monks or imported at great cost. Most doctors in medieval Europe had studied at one of the great universities, Salerno, Bologna, Paris, where lectures were given in Latin and attendance often required a wealthy patron. This privilege meant that a doctor was not merely a healer. They were a scholar, a keeper of fragile truth in a world still lit by superstition and firelight. But soon, their day would begin to move. The city would stir. In towns and cities across medieval Europe, doctors would don long robes, often black or dark blue, embroidered subtly if they were wealthy, and always functional. A belt around the waist might hold a pouch with coins, perhaps a few vials of dried herbs, and an amulet or two, because even doctors weren't immune to charms. They stepped into the streets not as healers in the modern sense, but as observers, listeners. The first step to healing was knowing. Most mornings, a doctor's first task was not to rush to a bedside, but to be summoned. Messenger boys or servants might arrive with hushed requests from merchants or nobles. Someone had a fever, someone could not sleep, someone was bleeding again. If the doctor served a wealthy patron, as many did, they would first attend to that household, where they might see several patients in one visit. Mother, children, servants, all lined up according to rank. The physician's job wasn't to perform surgery. That role belonged to barbers and other specialists. Physicians diagnosed. They interpreted urine. They read pulses and examined stools. They asked questions and listened to stories about dreams, about appetite, about celestial events, because to them, everything mattered. The stars and planets, for example, were vital. Astrology was a key tool in the doctor's kit. Before offering a diagnosis or treatment, they might consult an astrological chart, calculating the patient's zodiac sign and the position of the moon. They believed the body was directly influenced by the heavens, and ignoring such signs was not only unwise, it was dangerous. By late morning, a doctor might be walking, slowly, carefully, through cobblestone streets, past churches and bakeries to reach a patient in their home. Most homes were dim and drafty, lit by narrow windows or open doors. Here, the doctor's senses came to life. The smell of the room, the hue of the patient's skin, the sound of their breathing, all offered clues. And then, of course, there was the urine. Urine examination, or uroscopy, was considered a reliable diagnostic tool. Doctors carried a special flask called a matula, in which they would swirl the patient's sample and hold it up to the light. The color, sediment, smell, and even bubbles were read like omens. A golden-hued urine with fine bubbles might suggest a warm stomach and a healthy liver. A murky brown urine could be a sign of corruption, perhaps a fever or worse. They would ask about dreams, yes, dreams, and interpret their meanings. Dreams of falling might point to excess yellow bile. Dreams of drowning, too much phlegm. And if the patient was very ill, the doctor might call upon the barber surgeon. Bloodletting was common, leeches too. And if not those, then a purgative, made from herbs or minerals or something more exotic, like powdered antimony or crushed pearls. Each treatment was chosen not only to cure the disease, but to rebalance the humors and restore harmony to the body and soul. Afternoons were quieter. A return home might mean hours spent copying notes, writing letters, or reading. Some doctors served as teachers. They gave lectures to students, often in small groups, where texts were read aloud and discussed line by line. These lectures were not animated debates. They were solemn, rhythmic. The students scribbling with quills, rarely interrupted. Sometimes in wealthier cities, doctors gathered in collegia or guilds. There they exchanged ideas, debated cases, or discussed the latest medical texts arriving from the Islamic world. These moments were treasured. Most physicians worked alone, and the chance to share knowledge was precious. Evening approached slowly. The streets grew quiet. The doctor would light a small lamp, perhaps offer a prayer. If they were religious, and most were, they might end their day in a chapel, seeking guidance or absolution. For medicine, after all, was not infallible. Many patients did not recover. Many suffered. And in the flickering candlelight, a doctor might carry that burden with silence. And so the day closed. Not with triumph or fanfare, but with quiet. The doctor would sit again by their desk. They would open a book. They would write. They would wonder. And tomorrow they would begin again. Shall we continue? The candle burned lower now, its wax pooling quietly on the base of the iron holder, as the doctors sat once more at their desk. Night was fully settled across the town, cloaking the streets in silence, save for the distant clop of a horse's hooves or the soft hum of a lullaby through wooden shutters. In the stillness of this dim chamber, the physician pulled forth a fresh sheet of parchment and dipped their quill into ink the color of dried figs. They weren't writing to anyone, not really. This was not a letter. It was a record, an account of what they had seen, felt, guessed, feared. A patient's name, their complexion, the scent of their breath, the way they had trembled when the wind passed through the open shutters. These notes weren't just about medicine. They were about moments, whispers, terrors too soft to say aloud. You see, the doctor's work was more than the humors or the herbs. It was about knowing how people suffered and trying, with the fragile tools they had, to hold that suffering in their own hands. That night, as the doctor recorded their visit to a man with trembling limbs and bloodied gums, they paused. Something in the symptoms reminded them of another case, a young boy years ago who had wasted away during winter. The signs had been similar: pale skin, bleeding. The boy's mother had wept for 3 nights before he died, refusing to sleep while holding his hand even after it had grown cold. The doctor did not forget. Physicians in that time remembered everything. They had to. There were no libraries open to them, no access to vast databases. Memory was their storehouse, and sometimes it bled into their dreams. But sleep had to come, and when it did, it came in fragments. The next morning was a cold one. Frost had crept silently across the wooden shutters, and the hearth had gone out during the night. The doctor wrapped themselves in their robe, pulled on worn leather shoes, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, carrying with it the scent of smoke and wet stone. It was early, too early for most to be stirring, but not too early for sickness. The bells from the nearby chapel rang softly, each chime a ripple across the sleepy town. The doctor walked slowly toward the edge of the district, where smaller houses huddled close together, their wooden beams warped with time and damp. A woman had sent for him just before dawn. A servant girl in her household had collapsed without warning, feverish and muttering nonsense. When the doctor arrived, the house was dim, the doorway narrow, and the air inside hot with the stifling scent of rosemary and tallow. The girl lay on a straw mattress, her skin flushed and slick with sweat. Her eyes opened when the doctor approached, but they did not see. They stared past him into something far beyond the room. The physician knelt beside her and took her wrist, feeling the pulse, a thread, weak and fluttering, like a moth caught in a spider's web. He opened her mouth gently, saw her swollen tongue, the dryness of her lips. He asked the maid who attended her, She'd been fine the day before, they said. Ate a little bread, laughed even. Then, during the night, she began to cry out in her sleep. The doctor took a small pot from his satchel. Inside was a thick, sweet-smelling syrup made from poppy and hyssop. He lifted the girl's head and let a few drops fall on her tongue, whispering words he half believed. He did not know if it would work, but he knew she needed to rest. As he stood to leave, he gave instructions. Cool her head with cloth soaked in vinegar and rosewater. Keep the room dim. Burn dried sage to cleanse the air. And above all, do not let her be frightened. Fear, the doctor believed, could worsen the imbalance. The mind was not separate from the body, but one and the same. Walking back through the narrow streets, he passed an old man sitting on the stoop of a house. The man raised a hand in greeting. He had once been a soldier, wounded in the Crusades, and the doctor had helped stitch his leg after a gangrenous boil nearly took it. They nodded silently at one another. The bond between patient and doctor was often built not through words, but through memory. Back home, a new visitor waited. He was a merchant, well-fed and ruddy-cheeked, but anxious. He spoke quickly, stumbling over Latin phrases he thought might impress the physician. His wife, he said, was pregnant, and the midwife had concerns. Could the doctor come? Perhaps offer an elixir to ease the pain when the time came? The doctor agreed. Midwives handled most births, but when things went wrong, or when families had coin to spare, they turned to physicians. There was little he could do in truth, but he might offer valerian to soothe her nerves, or powdered coral to calm the child in the womb. The rest was prayer and patience. The merchant left, bowing too deeply. The doctor watched him go, then turned back to his texts. He had an hour before his next visit and planned to use it well. That hour was spent in the presence of Avicenna. The canon of medicine, written centuries before in a language not native to this land, was a book that sang to the doctor's soul. Its pages were filled with precision, beauty, and order. He read aloud in a whisper, allowing the cadence of the words to quiet the noise in his mind. But the quiet was short-lived. A knock at the door brought him back. A boy stood outside, cheeks pink from running, and handed him a note sealed with beeswax. It was from the priory. A monk had collapsed during morning prayers. There was concern he'd suffered some affliction of the mind. He'd screamed, then fallen silent, eyes wide and unblinking. The doctor closed his book gently, set down the quill, and rose once more. As he made his way toward the priory, past the grocer's and cobbler's opening shop, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. A sparrow perched on the ledge of a stone basin. A child laughed behind a curtain. A baker swept flour from his doorstep. Even in a world filled with sickness, there were fragments of grace. And so the doctor walked on into shadow and silence, where faith and doubt met behind stone walls, and where a healer's hands moved quietly through the mysteries of the day. The priory loomed ahead, its high walls weathered by rain and prayer alike, crowned with a simple cross that reached quietly into the gray sky. Ivy crept up its stone facade, clinging like old secrets, and the air smelled faintly of incense and cold earth. The physician passed through the iron gate without speaking. The monks had been expecting him. Inside, the corridors were hushed, as always. Footsteps echoed gently on flagstone, softened by age. The brother who met him was young, his robes too large, and his hands trembled slightly as he led the way. No words were exchanged at first. The doctor simply followed. They turned down a corridor flanked by high stained glass windows. Soft light painted shifting colors on the walls, red, blue, gold, and for a moment it felt like stepping into a dream. At the end of the hall lay Brother Theodoric. He was an old monk, long trusted with the priory's library and its fragile parchments. The kind of man who rarely spoke above a whisper and walked with the caution of one who has known loss. Now he lay on a low cot, his eyes open but seeing nothing. His lips moved faintly, as if reciting a prayer without voice. The physician knelt beside him. He placed 2 fingers against the man's wrist. The pulse was slow but even. A fine tremor moved along the monk's hand, up through the arm. He checked the tongue, pale, eyes unfocused. He asked the young brother what had happened. "We were reciting Tertiae," the monk said softly. He stopped speaking mid-line. He cried out just once and fell to the ground. We thought it might be possession. The physician did not react. He had heard the word before. Often, when illness defied logic or medicine, it became a question of spirits. But he did not believe this was a spirit. He examined the monk's breath, shallow but regular. He checked the scalp for injury, the limbs for stiffness. The tremor concerned him, a sudden cry, then collapse. It might be an apoplexy or a fit brought on by imbalance of the humors. The ancients had written of such things. The body, overwhelmed by heat or cold or emotion, might cause the brain to lose its command. He reached for a small pouch and drew out a pinch of powdered hellebore, used rarely and only with care. He steeped the powder in warmed water and waited for it to cool. He did not force it on the monk, not yet. First, he looked around the room. It was sparse, a wooden crucifix on the wall, a shelf of tightly bound texts, a table with a single beeswax candle, nearly burned down, nothing out of place, nothing corrupted. The young monk stood in the doorway watching. "He's been troubled, hasn't he?" the doctor asked gently. The monk hesitated. "Yes, he has spoken in his sleep, of fire, of books burning, of voices not his own." "Has he fasted recently?" "A 3-day vigil for St. Benedict." That was likely the cause. Fasting could bring clarity, yes, but also weakness, hallucinations, seizures. The doctor returned his focus to Brother Theodoric. He moistened a cloth with rose water and dabbed the old man's temples. He whispered not prayers, but instructions, to the body, to the soul. The monk would either wake or not. All the doctor could do now was ease the transition. He left tinctures behind, lavender for calm, willow bark to soothe the head, and spoke quietly with the prior. He explained that it might be a fever of the mind, brought on by exhaustion and devotion. The prior nodded, offering a silent thanks. As the doctor stepped back into the sunlight, the world felt oddly sharper. The scent of morning bread reached his nose. A crow landed nearby, pecking at something invisible. He pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders and made his way back to the heart of the town. The square was alive now. Market stalls opened like petals, revealing sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, skins of wine. But the doctor did not stop. He turned down a quieter road toward a house painted pale blue, nestled behind a low wall draped in vines. Inside lived a woman named Eleanor. She had once been a midwife herself, long before her legs began to stiffen and swell with the years. Now she lived alone, tending her herb garden and offering advice to those who came to her door. The doctor visited her not to treat, but to learn. She greeted him at the door, leaning on a carved stick, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You're early," she said, not unkindly. "A monk fell ill," the doctor replied. "Then you've come to cleanse the soul by talking to an old woman," she smiled. "Come." The rosemaries bloomed. They sat in her garden, the sun slowly rising behind a veil of clouds. Bees floated lazily from blossom to blossom, and the wind stirred the tall stalks of rue and sage. They spoke not of patience, but of roots, of recipes, of which herbs could draw out fever without drawing blood. Eleanor handed him a small bundle of leaves. "Motherwort," she said, "for that young merchant's wife." He had not mentioned the merchant. She always knew. He stayed for an hour, listening, asking questions, taking notes in his mind. Then he rose, thanked her, and left her with a single silver coin, which she tucked away without looking. The physician's path then took him past the cathedral, where masons chipped at stone and repaired archways worn by centuries. He paused to watch, a silent admiration in his gaze. Each man worked with care, guided by line and chisel, just as he did. He made one final stop that morning, at a house near the river. The child there had been coughing for weeks, growing thinner. The mother believed it was witchcraft. The doctor knew better. The room was damp. The child's bed sat against a stone wall that never dried. He advised moving the bed, raising it off the ground. He left herbs to ease the cough, marshmallow root, licorice, and honey. He promised to return in 2 days. The mother tried to pay him in copper. He refused. Sometimes the work wasn't about coin. As the sun climbed higher, the physician returned home. He sat once more at his desk, hands sore, eyes heavy. The town outside bustled, but inside the candle burned again. Books waited, parchments curled softly. A new patient would call before nightfall, no doubt. But for now he would write. Not of ailments, but of rosemary, and the sound of bees and the pale light through colored glass. And perhaps somewhere deep within, he would remember the monk's whisper, words formed without sound, and wonder whether medicine in the end was not about healing at all, but bearing witness to the silent truths others could not name. The sun dipped slowly toward the western hills, casting the town in a quiet amber hush. Shadows lengthened, softening the edges of rooftops and alleyways, turning bustling streets into gentle corridors of light and dusk. The physician sat by his small hearth, its flames low and wavering, cradling a warm cup of mulled wine seasoned lightly with clove and a shard of cinnamon bark. He did not drink often, but this evening had worn on him in ways he could not easily name. The house had fallen into silence. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly from travelers returning home, carts rolling toward stables, and the braying of donkeys far off beyond the river path. But within these walls, only the crackling of the fire spoke, softly, rhythmically, like breath. He opened a leather-bound journal, the cover worn smooth by time and touch. This was not for patience. This was for thoughts, observations that couldn't be shared or that lived between the lines of logic. He wrote slowly, ink trailing in curls and loops. Brother Theodric remained suspended in the void between silence and speech. His tremors worsened in moonlight. I suspect the vigil weakened more than his flesh. The fever speaks through him, or perhaps memory. He paused, then added, "The soul is not always kind to the body it inhabits." He set the journal aside and leaned back in the wooden chair, feeling each creak in the joints of his own bones. There were nights when he wondered whether the knowledge he held was enough, whether the balance of humors, the dried roots and powdered stones, the calculations of stars and tides, whether any of it truly held the power to keep suffering at bay. But doubt was a luxury he could not afford for long. A knock at the door stirred him from thought. He opened it to find a young man, barely more than a boy, dressed in the coarse wool of a stable hand. His cheeks were red from running, his breath shallow. "Sir, they said you would come," he panted. "My father, he fell. His leg is twisted." The physician nodded. He did not question. He wrapped himself in his cloak, fastened his satchel, and followed the boy into the gathering dark. They crossed through narrow alleys, past shuttered windows glowing with lamplight. The stable lay near the edge of the town, where the fields met the tree line, and the land smelled of hay and fresh soil. Horses snorted in the distance, and the rustling of straw was the only music. Inside the modest cottage, the father lay upon the floor, one leg bent at a sickening angle beneath him. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his jaw clenched against pain. A broken leg was no small thing. In the wrong hands, it could mean a lifetime of lameness, or death from fever if infection took hold. The physician knelt carefully, his palms flat against the earth as he examined the injury. He did not speak until he had felt along the bone, searching for sharp edges beneath the skin. The leg was broken cleanly, a single fracture near the shin. Swelling had already begun, purple and angry. "You'll need to hold him," he told the boy, who blanched but obeyed. From his satchel, the doctor drew 2 wooden slats, smooth and straight, saved for such a moment, and strips of boiled linen. He set the leg carefully, his touch deliberate and unhurried. The man groaned, nearly fainted, but the physician did not rush. Precision was kindness. When the splint was in place, he bound the leg tightly and applied a poultice of comfrey and pine resin. "Do not let him walk," he instructed, "not for a fortnight, and cleanse the cloth daily. If the skin reddens or smells sweet, send for me." The boy nodded, still wide-eyed. The father whispered a slurred thanks, already slipping into a haze of pain and exhaustion. The physician washed his hands in a basin outside, using rainwater and a bit of lye soap. The night air was cold on his skin, a sharp reminder of the world's weight. He stood for a while under the stars, watching their steady glow. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the field's edges, where tall grasses swayed in unison with the breeze. On his way back through the town, he passed by a chapel where candlelight flickered through stained glass. The door stood ajar. Inside, a lone monk knelt in prayer, his lips moving in silent rhythm. The physician did not enter, but he paused, listening. There was something in that silence that felt heavier than any illness, a waiting, perhaps, a hunger or grief. He continued onward, turning toward the river path. There, the sound of water was ever present, rushing over stones, carving its story into the land, never still. He liked to walk here when the burdens of the day became too heavy. The river did not ask questions, it only moved. Near a bend in the path stood an old willow tree, its branches draping like a curtain. Beneath it, years ago, he had tended to a dying nobleman, struck down by a fever that stole his breath and his mind. The man's wife had knelt there, gripping the doctor's arm, begging him to do something more. But there had been nothing left to do. He had stayed until the man's final breath. He had whispered a prayer he barely believed, and then he had walked home alone. The willow still stood. Its bark bore the scars of age, of storms weathered in silence. The physician reached out and touched it, feeling the cool dampness of the wood beneath his fingertips. He wondered how many others had come here to mourn. Eventually, he returned to his home, the hearth now only embers, the room still. He poured the last of the wine and warmed it by the fire's dying glow. His hands trembled slightly, not from age not yet, but from the slow accumulation of sorrow and motion. He wrote again by candlelight. Set bone near the river path. Boy was brave. Father will live if the wound stays clean. Thank Eleanor for the poultice recipe, stronger than mine. He closed the journal, extinguished the candle, and lay down upon his cot. No sheets of silk, no feathered pillows, just wool and wood and sleep that came like a tide, slow, steady, uncertain. And the town that ancient patient breathed on. Morning returned with a hush. No bird song, no clamor from the market, only the soft patter of rain against the shutters and the occasional distant groan of wood as the wind passed through the eaves. It was the kind of day that felt wrapped in linen, quiet, dim, and still. The doctor awoke to the scent of damp ash and rosemary, the embers in the hearth now little more than sleeping coals under a thin veil of gray. He rose slowly, each joint stiff with the memory of yesterday's bending, walking, kneeling. The floor was cold beneath his feet. He washed with rainwater collected in a ceramic basin, and the coldness bit at his skin, pulling him sharply into the day. There were letters waiting. 2, folded neatly on the table beneath the window. One bore the red wax seal of the guild, an ornate stamp pressed with some urgency. The other, unmarked, was written in a softer hand, the parchment smudged at the edges as though it had been gripped tightly for some time. He opened the unmarked letter first. My daughter Annaline has taken to fits again. They come in the early hours, just after the cocks crow, and leave her weak, breathless, and ashamed. The local priest insists it is a punishment for pride. But I know my child. She is gentle. Please come. I will wait near the stone bridge at midday. There was no name signed, but he knew the hand. It belonged to a weaver's wife, Elira, whose daughter he had seen 3 winters ago when the girl first collapsed during a spring festival, her eyes rolling back, her limbs seizing like a puppet yanked on tangled strings. The townsfolk had whispered of possession then too. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his cloak. Then the guild's missive. To all practicing physicians under guild protection, a suspected case of plague has been reported outside the northern wall. A washerwoman, age unknown, has died with swelling beneath the arms and blackened lesions on the legs. Physicians are to report signs of similar illness immediately. Contact with the body is discouraged. He read the words twice. Plague. It was not the first time he'd seen the word, nor would it be the last, but it always landed like a stone in the gut. He had lost colleagues, friends, entire streets once, to the swell of pestilence that moved like smoke, unseen until it strangled. He did not hesitate. He would go to the northern wall. But first, he would keep his promise to Elira. By midday, the rain had faded to a mist that clung to everything, hair, wool, skin. The stone bridge rose quietly from the earth, moss-covered and old, its arch bending like a back that bore too many winters. Beneath it, the river was swollen, moving fast, brown with silt and flecked with floating leaves. Elira stood waiting, her hood drawn low, her eyes shadowed. She said nothing when he arrived, only led him with hurried steps down a muddy path to a cottage he remembered well. It was modest, wattle and daub with a thatched roof and a crooked wooden gate, but clean, lovingly tended. Inside, the girl sat beside the hearth, curled on a small stool, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face was pale, lashes dark with unshed tears. She did not look up when the doctor entered. She's been frightened since the last fit, Elira whispered. The priest said she must sleep on a stone floor, that she must be scourged with nettle branches. I couldn't. Her voice broke. The physician knelt before the girl. Annaline, he said gently, do you remember me? She looked up slowly and nodded. There was shame in her eyes, but also trust. Do you remember what happens before the fit? She hesitated. A smell like smoke, but sweet. My fingers go cold. Then I don't remember. The doctor nodded. He touched her wrist too fast. Skin, clammy. He lifted her eyelids gently. They trembled but focused. This was no possession. It was a condition of the nerves, what some text the falling sickness, morbus sacer. It could not be cured, but it could be calmed. Certain herbs, skullcap, valerian, monkshood, offered brief reprieve. More importantly, she needed peace. Not fear, not punishment. He spoke quietly to Alira, gave her a list of herbs and instructions for preparation. No fasting, he warned, and let her sleep through the morning bell. Wakefulness too early can trigger the fits. He turned to Annaline, placed a small pouch of dried leaves in her palm, and closed her fingers over it. This isn't magic, he said, but it will help your body remember how to stay quiet. She nodded again, and for the first time smiled. The walk to the northern wall took him past the outer fields where crows circled low and the earth smelled rich with decay. The washerwoman's cottage stood alone, away from the cluster of homes that made up the quarter. No smoke rose from its chimney. A piece of white cloth hung on the door, a sign of death, a warning. A woman stood outside, her hands red from scrubbing. She was the washerwoman's sister, she said. Hadn't left her side during the final days. She had a boil, she explained, under her arm. Then came the fever, her skin went black. The physician did not enter. He asked instead about the smell, the swelling, the way the body had changed. The signs were not entirely clear yet. It could have been a carbuncle, a poisoned wound, but the timing chilled him. He left instructions. Burn the bedding, bury the clothes, wash hands with vinegar and ash. As he walked away, he noted every person who lived nearby, mentally marking the homes he would watch for in the coming days. Illness did not always come like a storm. Sometimes it crept, quiet, patient. Back in the town, the bells rang none, the hour of mid-afternoon prayer. People paused in their work, heads bowed in reverence or routine. The doctor passed silently among them, his mind heavy. At his home, he set water to boil. He prepared strips of linen soaked in wine and rosemary. He crushed dried juniper berries, mixed them with beeswax and fat, and poured the blend into small pots. If the plague came, there would be no time to prepare then. He wrote, a girl tormented by sleep and shame, a town poised on the breath before illness. There is still time. There is always a moment before the fall when everything holds its breath. He sealed the words in silence and waited for the knock that would surely come before night. The knock came just as twilight began to stretch its cool fingers across the stone streets, dimming lanterns before they were lit. It was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. The doctor rose from his writing desk, spine stiff, and opened the door to find a boy no older than 10, soaked from the misting rain and clutching a damp scrap of parchment in both hands. She sent me, the boy said, from the inn, a traveler's coughing blood. He didn't wait for a reply, only turned and ran down the narrow alley, feet splashing through shallow puddles, cloak flapping like a crow's wings in flight. The doctor did not follow immediately. He stood for a moment longer in the threshold, letting the evening air wash over him. A traveler coughing blood. Those were words to stir worry, to stir memory. He gathered his satchel slowly but deliberately, checking the contents. A small jar of camphor salve, dried horehound, several bundles of yarrow, a flask of strong spirits, and a mask made of linen soaked in wormwood and vinegar. It was crude but comforting in moments when one walked into rooms steeped in breath that clung to the skin like oil. The inn lay tucked near the edge of the square, where travelers arrived beneath the worn timbers of its eaves, shedding road dust and coin in equal measure. Its sign, a rusted bell, creaked in the wind above the doorway. When the doctor entered, the warmth of the hearth rushed to meet him, along with the scent of boiled onions, damp wool, and ale. The innkeeper, a sturdy woman with red cheeks and tired eyes, nodded him toward the back stairwell without a word. He's in the upper room, she muttered. Came in last night from the south. Paid well. Then started choking not 2 hours ago. We put him alone. The doctor climbed slowly. The stairs moaned underfoot, and the air grew heavier with each step. Outside the small room at the end of the corridor, he paused. From within came the unmistakable sound of ragged breathing, wet and laborious. He opened the door without knocking. The traveler lay on a cot pressed against the far wall. He was not yet old, perhaps 30, perhaps less, but already the sickness had carved its signature upon him. His lips were cracked and stained dark. His skin glistened with sweat. A smear of blood traced from the corner of his mouth to his chin, dried like wine spilled on parchment. The doctor approached quietly, pulling the cloth over his mouth and nose. He knelt, felt the man's forehead. It burned. He checked the glands beneath the jaw, swollen. Then the armpits. A lump, tender and hot, the size of a small plum. He sat back slowly. This was plague. There was no longer doubt. The man stirred. His eyes opened, glass gray but not yet gone. "I thought I'd outrun it," he rasped. "Left Ainswich before they locked the gates. Too many dead." His voice cracked like dry bark. The doctor gave him water, just a sip. Then he pulled a folded cloth from his satchel and gently wiped the man's face. He did not ask why the traveler had come north. Fear, most likely, or the desperate illusion that one could outpace fate. He left the room without a word. In the corridor, the innkeeper waited. "You'll need to shut the inn," he said. "Seal this room. Burn everything he touched." Her face tightened. "We'll lose everything." "You'll lose more if you don't." She said nothing more, only nodded. Back in his home, the doctor opened the shutters slightly and let the air move through. He stripped off his cloak, soaked it in wine and ash, and hung it near the hearth. Then he sat again, hands trembling, and lit a fresh candle. The flame was small but steady. He wrote, "The pest has returned, quiet as a breath, loud as thunder. I saw it in his eyes, the same hollow I saw in Margot the baker when the fever came to our quarter 10 years past. It begins with heat and ends in silence. The town must be warned." But how does one speak of plague without causing panic? The memory of fire and flight was still raw in many hearts. Families who had buried children in shallow graves. Streets once emptied of sound except for the tolling of bells. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the night wrapped itself around the town like a thick cloak. Lanterns flickered faintly along the alleys. Somewhere, a lullaby drifted through the air, a mother singing a child to sleep, unaware that illness once again brushed the town's edge. He prepared packets of herbs known to help the breath, hyssop, elderflower, mint. He placed them near the door, ready to distribute by morning. Then, taking a clean scrap of parchment, he began drafting a letter to the town bailiff. One confirmed case, high fever, buboes, respiratory involvement, traveled from the south, immediate containment advised. All public gatherings must cease, markets to be reduced, churches warned. He sealed the letter with wax and set it aside. Then he lit a taper, stepped into the alley, and walked in the direction of the watchman's post. The town did not yet know it had entered a new chapter. The kind written in trembling ink and soot, the kind shaped by the quiet steps of a physician carrying news like a spark in the folds of his cloak. The wind picked up as he walked, not strong, but sharp. It smelled faintly of rosemary and smoke. The watchman's post was little more than a lean-to of stone and timber, wedged between the eastern wall and the old tannery, where the smell of lime and hide still clung to the soil even years after the last vat had dried. A single lantern swung from a hook outside the door, its glow barely piercing the veil of mist that drifted low along the street. The doctor approached slowly. The letter he carried pressed like a weight against his chest, still warm from the heat of the candle wax. He knocked twice, firm, quiet. Inside, the watchman stirred. A broad man with a thick brow and soot-lined fingers, he squinted through the gloom as he opened the door. "Physician," he said, voice thick with sleep or drink. The doctor handed him the letter without preamble. It must reach the bailiff before dawn. The watchman hesitated, reading the seal, then the first line. His face changed, not dramatically, but in that way a face hardens when it meets a familiar dread. "God's teeth," he muttered. "Not again." "You remember last time," the doctor said softly. "I remember burying my wife in a ditch outside the southern gate." They said no more. The watchman tucked the letter into his coat and walked toward the town center, boots striking the cobblestones like muffled bells. The doctor watched until the man disappeared into the fog. He turned back through the narrow alleys, and now nearly silent. A cat darted between shadows. Somewhere, a child coughed in their sleep. He could feel the city drawing in on itself, the way people did when they sensed the tide turning before the water touched their feet. At home, he didn't sleep. Instead, he boiled cloth in wine and vinegar, hung bundles of dried wormwood near the windows, and sharpened his knives, not for surgery, but for cutting bandages, stripping herbs, trimming roots. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding him through preparations made many times before. Just before dawn, a knock. He opened the door to find a familiar face, Elias, the town's gravedigger. A man with a back bowed from years of digging and eyes that never blinked quite fast enough. He smelled of soil and rain. "I heard," Elias said, "from the watchman." The doctor stepped aside. Inside, they sat with the candle burning low between them. "She'll want a trench," Elias murmured. "God willing, we won't need one." Elias nodded. "But if we do?" The doctor hesitated. "Southfield, away from the well." They shared a silence that belonged to men who had buried too much already. When Elias left, the sky had begun to pale, a faint blue creeping across the horizon like spilled milk. The physician stood in the doorway for a long time, arms crossed against the cold. He remembered the last outbreak, the cries from shuttered homes, the carts rolling through the streets at dusk, the long rows of candles left burning outside each door where someone had died. He had walked through it all then, younger, faster, still believing there was something definitive he could do to stop it. This time he knew better. That morning, he began visiting homes, quietly, not to cause alarm, but to watch, to listen. He checked the butcher's boy who had taken ill 2 days before with a fever. No lesions, clear breath, just a common flux. Still, the physician left a small satchel of dried coltsfoot and strict instructions not to attend the stall for a week. He visited the schoolhouse, spoke briefly with the nun who taught the children their letters and hymns. She noticed his tone, his questions. "You've seen it," she said simply. He nodded. "Will you tell the priests?" "I've written the bailiff. He'll tell them." She placed a hand over her rosary. "Then I'll pray." He looked at the children through the open door. At small hands raised, eyes bright with the light of learning, he envied their ignorance. By midday, he stood in the center of the square, watching the market shrink. Vendors whispered between stalls. News moved faster than rats in alleyways. He saw the baker's apprentice pack his bread early, saw the clothier shutter her stall while casting nervous glances over her shoulder. The town was beginning to brace. That afternoon, a rider arrived from the northern road. Dusty, pale, his horse foaming at the mouth. He brought word from Ainswick, 30 dead in 3 days. The gates sealed. No travel in or out. The physician listened, took the man's pulse, gave him water, then marked the saddle with red chalk and tied a sprig of juniper to the reins. Not a cure, a warning. At dusk, the doctor walked to the chapel. Not for confession, for the records. Father Gervais, the parish priest, met him at the side door. He was a gaunt man with parchment-thin skin and the smell of incense clinging to his robes. "I won't hold mass tomorrow," he said before the doctor even spoke. "You know then. I know fear when I see it, and my pews are full of it." They descended into the crypt where the church kept its ledgers, names, baptisms, deaths. The doctor scanned them, searching for patterns, fevers, sudden deaths, a spike in infant loss, all the quiet murmurs of illness spreading before it has a name. 4 unusual deaths in the last fortnight. He closed the book gently. "We'll need a space," he murmured, "somewhere to bring the sick. Is the old refectory still standing?" "It is, but it hasn't been used in years." "Then we'll start there." The priest nodded. As the doctor stepped out into the evening once more, he looked up at the steeple and saw no birds on its ledge. Only the wind, cold and bare. He thought of the traveler, of Annaline, of the washerwoman whose name he still didn't know, and he whispered, almost without meaning to, "Let it not be like last time." Then he turned back to his work. There was still so much to do. The old refectory stood at the edge of the priory grounds, long forgotten, swallowed by ivy and time. Its roof sagged slightly at the center, and the wooden beams above the doorway had blackened with age, streaked by rain and the soft rot of neglect. Still, the stone beneath held firm. The doctor pushed the door open with both hands, wincing at the groan of the hinges, and stepped inside. Dust rose in motes, swirling through beams of wan light that filtered through high, grimy windows. The long tables were still there, bare and stained by the ghosts of forgotten meals. A single iron chandelier hung crooked above, one of its arms bent like a broken finger. It would serve. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, dragging benches to the sides, stacking them beneath the windows. He spread straw across the floor, thick enough to muffle footsteps and soften the bones of those who might soon lie upon it. He opened the shutters, letting the chill wind scour the air, and burned handfuls of sage and dried bay leaves in a copper bowl to clear what he could not see. One of the novices from the priory, a thin boy named Tomas, arrived without being asked. He said little, only watched for a while before rolling up his sleeves and beginning to sweep. They worked in silence. There was something holy in it. Not sacred, exactly, but reverent, as if even the act of preparing the place where the sick would suffer demanded a kind of grace. By the time the sun began to drift westward again, the room was ready, bare, clean, waiting. The doctor placed his satchel near the door and began assembling a table for tools. He laid out a small iron mortar and pestle, a roll of linen bandages, his vials of tinctures, packets of crushed herbs wrapped in wax cloth, a flask of alcohol, a knife with a bone handle, tweezers, thread. He was not preparing to heal. He was preparing to endure. Word had begun to spread. That evening, a woman came, alone, cloaked and hooded. Her eyes were red, and she carried a small bundle in her arms. The child in it did not stir. He was coughing, she whispered. Then yesterday, he wouldn't wake. The doctor peeled back the cloth slowly. The boy was pale, mouth slack, a thin trickle of blood crusted at the corner of his lips, a single dark swelling beneath the jaw. He had been dead for hours. Still, the doctor touched his skin. Still, he listened for breath. Still, he pressed fingers to the pulse point in the neck, as if some part of him refused to believe. Then he stepped back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The mother stood still for a long moment, then bowed her head. "I didn't want to bury him without knowing." He nodded. "I'll take him," she added. "I'll take him myself." But he stopped her. "No," he said. "Leave him here. The fields are not safe now. The gravedigger will come." She did not argue. She only laid the child gently on a straw mat and left without another word. The first body. He covered the boy with a linen sheet and sat nearby for some time, his hands folded in his lap, listening to the wind whistle through the cracked stones. That night, he made his rounds again, discreet, cautious. He knocked on the apothecary's door and was let in by candlelight. The shelves were half empty already. He took what he needed: mandrake, licorice root, vinegar, a fresh roll of linen, and left coin behind. He passed by the baker's, the school, the town well. All quiet, all too quiet. People were holding their breath. Outside the candlemaker's shop, he saw a figure sitting alone on the stoop. An old man, his back bowed, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The doctor slowed. The man looked up. His eyes were milky with age but clear with purpose. "She's sick," he said. "My granddaughter. I don't want to take her to the chapel. Too many eyes." "Where is she now?" the doctor asked. The man gestured toward the narrow alley behind the shop. "Second door, upstairs." The doctor went. The room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a chair, and a cracked window. The girl lay beneath a woven blanket, hair stuck to her forehead, breath shallow. Her eyes opened as he approached. They were glassy but still watching. He knelt beside her. "Tell me where it hurts," he said softly. She didn't answer with words, only turned her head and whispered, "My neck." He felt the skin, hot, pulsing, tight with swelling beneath the ear. He checked her hands. No lesions, no bleeding. It was early still, or perhaps something else. He gave her water with thyme and honey, wiped her brow, and instructed her grandfather in quiet tones. "Boil all her linens. Burn what you must. Keep her warm, but let the air move." "Will she live?" the old man asked. "I don't know," the doctor replied honestly. When he returned to the refectory, the boy's body still lay undisturbed. The candle beside him had burned nearly to the base, and yet the room felt different, not darker, just more aware. He sat for a while, then rose and added the child's name to a fresh ledger he had begun keeping beside the tools. The first line on the first page: Matthew, age 4, son of Sabine, symptom, fever, swelling, blood from mouth, deceased. The second line, he hoped, would take longer to write, but in his bones he knew it wouldn't. The morning came veiled in silence, not the peaceful hush of a resting town, but a strange held breath, like the air itself had grown cautious. A few shutters creaked open, faces peered through slits in wood and quickly vanished again. No bells rang from the chapel, no carts rolled over cobblestones. The town was waiting, listening, watching. The doctor stepped into the street with the weight of the night still clinging to him. His boots pressed the wet earth softly, leaving tracks that would soon be lost in the rising mist. In one hand, he carried a wooden case. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, were the herbs he prepared overnight, bundled for distribution. Each packet held his quiet hope, though he knew hope was no longer enough. As he walked toward the market square, he noticed signs of withdrawal. The fountain at the center, once a place of gossip and laughter, stood alone, the water's echo bouncing through the empty space. Stalls remained but covered, cloaked in canvas like corpses awaiting burial. Even the pigeons seemed reluctant to land. He stopped at the apothecary's again, this time leaving bundles on the stoop. A note beside them read, "For breath, for strength, for fear." He didn't knock. Further along, he paused at the baker's home. Inside, the woman known to all as Morel watched him from the window. She opened it just a sliver. "My son," she whispered, "his hands have gone cold. Keep him wrapped. Rub them with oil and thyme. Watch for fever." She nodded, eyes wide with the fragile clarity of terror. He gave her a pouch and moved on. By midday, he had distributed over 20 such bundles, each tailored to the household, each prepared with the care of someone who knew they might be the last remedy a family ever touched. He passed a group of young men hauling sacks of barley into a cellar, strong, quick, laughing a little too loudly. They lowered their eyes when they saw him. Laughter faded into footsteps. Near the chapel gate, Father Gervais waited. His robes were clean but creased. His hands trembled faintly, though whether from age or apprehension was unclear. "They've begun coming to me," he said. "Not for confession, for final rites." The doctor studied the priest's face. "Are you giving them?" "I am, but I've stopped laying hands on the brow. I hold my hands over them and I pray." "You're wise." "I'm frightened." "So am I." They stood in silence for a while, side by side, looking out at the courtyard beyond the gate, where the shadows of old trees flickered in the wind like ghosts stretching. "Word came this morning," the priest added. "A merchant's wife in the west quarter. The swelling has reached her chest, and a laundress near the mill. She collapsed into the river before she could scream." The doctor said nothing. He already knew. He returned to the refectory by late afternoon. The air inside felt different, still pungent with herbs and straw, but now touched by something else, the scent of sweat, fear, the beginning of decay. Another child lay on a mat, a girl this time, 10, perhaps 11. Her mother knelt beside her, rocking slightly, humming an old lullaby. "She grew tired this morning," the woman said when he knelt. "Said her legs hurt, then she began coughing. I brought her here because I didn't want to wait." The doctor gently touched the girl's forehead. Fever. He parted her lips, saw the red swelling at her throat, already tender. No lesions yet, but they would come. Her breathing was shallow, labored. He prepared a wash of cooled water and vinegar, soaked a cloth and pressed it gently to her skin. He gave her a draught of crushed marjoram and licorice root. Whispered words meant more for the mother than the child. "She came quietly," the mother said. "Didn't cry. She told me not to worry." He stayed with them for a while. At the back of the room, Elias, the gravedigger, sat sharpening a shovel slowly with a whetstone, each pass of the blade echoing faintly through the room. He looked up once, nodded, and continued his work. That night, 2 more arrived. A mason in his 30s, carried in by his brother, breath rattling like stones in a cup, and a midwife, gray-faced and trembling, leaning on a cane. She said she had tended to a birth 3 nights past. The mother had died the next morning. "She coughed blood on the sheets," she whispered, eyes wide. The doctor placed them at opposite ends of the room, spacing the mats with as much distance as the space allowed. He hung dampened cloth soaked in vinegar along the windows, set bowls of burning rosemary in each corner, and tied sprigs of rue and tansy to the lintels. It was not medicine in the purest sense, but ritual held power too, power to soothe, to signal care, to keep despair from seeping deeper. He wrote their names in the ledger. Elise, age 10, fever, swelling, alive. Marceau, age 35, chest congestion, hemoptysis. Agath, midwife, exposure, early signs, alive. 3 more lines, 3 more lives suspended between breath and silence. Before sleep, he walked once more to the chapel. He found Father Gervais lighting candles in rows along the altar. "For those we cannot name," the priest said. The doctor stood beside him, and together they lit a dozen flames, then 20 more, until the chapel glowed with small lights. And even though outside the night had swallowed the town in full, inside there was a hush that felt not safe, not hopeful, but sacred. He did not speak. Neither did the priest. There was nothing left to say. By the next morning, the sickness had grown teeth. It no longer crept. It moved. It reached into homes without knocking, left its signature behind in sweat-soaked linens and the smell of rot buried beneath lavender and lime wash. The streets remained quiet, but the quiet had changed. It was no longer the pause of uncertainty. It was the hush of dread, low, brittle, bracing. The refectory, once still and expectant, was now alive with fevered breath and whispered prayers. Elise had grown quieter in the night, her lips cracking, her voice reduced to a sound like dry wind over parchment. Her mother remained at her side, eyes rimmed red, but lips closed tight, like one who had already begun rehearsing grief. Marceau had worsened. The swelling beneath his jaw had grown purple and taut, the skin stretched and hot, like fruit left to rot in the sun. His brother, who had carried him in, now sat against the wall, refusing food, eyes fixed on his sibling, with a gaze that seemed frozen somewhere between guilt and disbelief. The midwife, Agathe, had not moved since dawn. She sat on her mat, head bowed, her hands wrapped in a damp cloth. She whispered to herself in a rhythm too quiet to understand. The doctor did not interrupt her. He moved among them with quiet footsteps, linen mask tied firm across his face, sleeves rolled, hands scrubbed raw with wine and lye. His tools lay arranged on the table like a soldier's arms, vials of tincture, shears, needles, string, a razor. For Elise, he mixed a syrup of honey and powdered elderflower, coaxing her to take it in slow sips. He washed her face with cool water and let her mother rub balm into the child's legs, if only to remind her hands that they still held purpose. For Marceau, there was little to do. He was slipping. The doctor could see it in the shallow breaths, the gray cast beneath the skin, the way he no longer blinked when the light changed. He whispered a few words, offered a touch to the shoulder of the brother, and stepped back. By late morning, a group of townsfolk gathered outside the refectory, keeping distance. They did not cross the threshold. Their hands held bundles, herbs, loaves of bread, candles. They laid them near the door and stepped back in silence. The doctor emerged only long enough to bow his thanks, collect the offerings, and disappear again. Inside, he opened the satchel left by someone unknown. A sprig of mint, a twist of dried sage, a folded letter with a single line. If we cannot heal, at least let us not forget. He tucked the letter into the ledger. Before noon, 2 more were brought in. One was a man named Rule, the town's lamplighter, who had collapsed while trimming the wick near the chapel. His eyes rolled in his head, and his lips foamed as if some great tide within him had turned to poison. The other, a servant girl from the merchant's quarter, arrived pale and shivering, with blotches blooming across her arms like spilled ink. There were now 6. The doctor organized their bedding into 2 rows, leaving space between each straw mat. He began marking their positions in chalk on the stone floor, in case the mats shifted, so he could remember who had come first, who might be next. He recorded each new name. Rule, lamplighter, fever, seizure, alive. Clemence, servant, rash, chills, early signs, alive. Elias came at midday with a cart draped in black cloth. He said nothing, only looked to the doctor with that same question buried in his face. The doctor nodded. Marceau was gone. They wrapped him in a linen shroud, no ceremony, no hymn, and placed him at the back of the cart. The brother followed behind, silent. When they reached the burial field, they found it marked with fresh posts and rope, plots planned in rows, each spaced to avoid the touch of one grave to the next. The gravedigger began to dig. The brother knelt by the hole, his face turned away, his fists clenched in the dirt. The doctor laid a hand on his shoulder, then left him there with the wind and the silence and the crows that watched from the high branches. By the time the doctor returned, Clemence had begun to convulse. Her limbs snapped like cords pulled taut, her back arching as a cry tore from her lips. The others watched, some with fear, some with that blank, resigned stillness that took root when the mind could no longer absorb more grief. The doctor moved quickly, held her head, steadied her limbs, muttered calm under his breath. After the fit passed, she lay still, unconscious but breathing. He He soaked a cloth in wormwood and laid it on her chest, then marked the time in his ledger. In the corner of the refectory, Tomas the novice continued his work, emptying basins, fetching water, setting bowls of burning herbs near the doors. He said little, but his presence was like a lantern in a long tunnel, faint but constant. The sun began to lower. The light through the high windows turned amber, then rust-colored, casting long shadows across the floor like the spokes of a broken wheel. The doctor stood at the window for a while, watching. He saw no movement outside, no passers-by, no children playing, only wind in the trees and smoke curling from distant chimneys and the faint glow of a lantern being lit, perhaps by another lamplighter, perhaps by none at all. Back inside, Elise opened her eyes. She didn't speak, just looked at him. Her breath was shallow, but even. Her mother wept quietly into her sleeve, careful not to make a sound. He let the girl hold his hand for a moment, just for a moment. Then he stood, lit another candle, and turned back to his ledger. There were still pages to fill. By the 11th day since the first traveler coughed blood onto the wooden floorboards of the inn, the rhythm of the town had changed completely. It no longer breathed in time with the sun or the tolling of the bells. It breathed in fever and silence, in doorways cracked open just wide enough to pass food or prayer or a glance, in paths worn between homes and the refectory by cautious footsteps and grief-heavy souls, in the soft sound of cloth bundles laid gently near thresholds, bundles of herbs or clean water, or sometimes nothing but a note. The refectory itself had become its own small world. The air inside was thick now, not putrid, but dense with breath and fear, and the scent of vinegar-soaked linens hung to dry and reuse. The doctor had opened every window he could, but wind was a rare visitor, and the smell of sickness clung like mist to every surface. The candles burned low throughout the day, not for light, but to remind the living of the boundary between night and day, between waiting and mourning. There were now 9 patients in the room. Each lay on a separate straw pallet, spaced out in a rough geometry of illness and necessity. Chalk marks on the stone floor beneath them grew more elaborate, small notations, symbols, a quiet code the doctor had devised to track their hours, their pulses, the changes in their breath. For most, the changes were slow, subtle, but always in one direction. Elise had not spoken in over a day. Her fever had plateaued, but her eyes had dimmed. When she blinked now, it was as though through water. Her mother remained by her side, no longer weeping, no longer speaking. She simply wiped the girl's hands with warm cloth and hummed, a sound barely audible. Agath, the midwife, had taken to speaking in half sentences. She did not appear delirious. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "She came with the moon," she whispered once, staring at nothing. "I saw her, white hands, black breath." The doctor listened but did not interrupt. He knew there were things the mind clutched at when the body grew uncertain. He wrote down her words nonetheless, in the margins of his ledger. The mason's brother had not returned since the burial. A cloth parcel had been left at the door of the refectory the morning after. 3 loaves of black bread and a small jar of pickled roots. Nothing else. The doctor understood. Grief took men in strange ways. That afternoon, a girl arrived at the threshold. She could not have been more than 14, wearing a cloak too large for her, and carrying a basket wrapped in damp cloth. She stood just outside the doorway and said nothing. Tomas approached her first, speaking in soft tones. She only nodded, handed him the basket, and turned away. Inside it, 5 sprigs of sage, a small wax-sealed vial of rose oil, and a folded scrap of paper. On it, in crooked writing, "He coughed in the night. I made him tea. He asked for more water, but when I returned, he had gone. I lit a candle and left the door open." There was no name. The doctor closed the paper carefully and placed it into the same box where he kept the other letters, the ones not meant for records, but for remembering. In the late hours of the afternoon, the priest returned. Father Gervais carried a long bundle wrapped in linen. He held it close, but gently, and his face had the pale, set stillness of one who has already wept and found there are no more tears left to spend. "It was Tomas's brother," he said quietly. "The blacksmith." The doctor did not ask why the boy had not said anything. Some grief, like some wounds, bled inward. They unwrapped the cloth together and prepared the body. The marks of the sickness were clear: swelling in the neck and armpit, tongue darkened, fingertips turned gray. They washed the skin in water and wine, wrapped the limbs tightly, and called for Elias. The gravedigger arrived with his usual silence, his cart covered now with a heavy woolen cloth. He took the body without question. He only asked, "How many today?" "Two," the doctor said. He helped lift the shroud. "But the night is long." Later, as dusk settled like a shroud over the rooftops, the doctor sat near the girl, Elise. Her mother had fallen asleep, slumped against the stone wall, her arms still draped across her child. The candle at the bedside flickered. The girl's eyes opened slowly, not wide, but enough. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. The doctor leaned closer. "The bells," she said, "in the fields. They ring under the earth." He said nothing, only held her hand. She slept again. That night, the doctor wrote more than usual. The candle burned nearly to the base. He chronicled each movement of the day, the fever spikes, the seizures, the gifts left at the door. He recorded Agate's whispers, Elise's vision, the visit from the priest, the way the air had changed when the door opened after sunset, how it seemed heavier, slower, like the breath of the building itself had grown tired. And then he stopped. He looked out through the open window at the stars, faint behind the thin veil of clouds. The wind stirred finally, and for a moment he thought he could smell the river. He wrote one final line before sleep. "This plague does not scream. It sighs. It waits. It watches. And so must we." The 12th day began before the sun, as many of them now did, not with the cock's crow or a knock at the door, but with a sound so small it might have been mistaken for the settling of beams or the rustle of wind against thatch. A breath, then none. The doctor was already awake when it happened. He often did not sleep now, not truly. He dozed in a chair by the window, upright, boots still on, cloak draped over his lap. His dreams, when they came, were fevered and brief, filled with the sound of coughing, the weight of unopened letters, the steady scratching of quill against parchment that never quite wrote the words he needed. He felt it before he heard it, a shift in the air of the refectory, like a draft from nowhere. He stood, stretched his arms slowly, and made his way toward the corner where Elise lay. Her mother was awake, though her posture had not changed. She sat upright, but her hands no longer moved, and her eyes were fixed on something distant, unreachable. She did not speak as the doctor approached. Elise was still, too still. He knelt beside her, placed 2 fingers against the delicate bone of her neck. Waited. Nothing. He lowered his head, listened for breath. There was only silence. Her eyes were closed and her mouth slightly open as though in mid-question. The fever had faded, leaving a faint sheen on her brow. Her small fingers rested curled near her cheek, and the final exhale had softened her features. He reached for the linen cloth, but her mother lifted a hand slowly and drew the covering herself. The doctor did not try to offer comfort. There were no words, only presence. He sat for a while beside them, until the candle at the girl's bedside gave a final flicker and went out. Then, with practiced hands, he wrote her name in the ledger. Elise, age 10, deceased. He didn't note the hour. He didn't need to. The day itself would remember. Tomas arrived soon after with fresh water and a bundle of rosemary tied in twine. The boy said nothing when he saw the shrouded form. He only bowed his head and laid the herbs gently near her mat. They buried her at mid-morning. Elias had already prepared the place, a soft patch near the edge of the field, beneath a gnarled elm whose roots tangled like sleeping arms. The soil turned easily, damp from the night's mist. The gravedigger worked without complaint, the rhythm of the spade a kind of hymn. Her mother remained behind, silent. She did not follow the cart. The doctor stayed until the last of the dirt had been packed. He planted the rosemary at the head of the grave, then stood back as Elias pressed his boot to the mound and flattened it gently, reverently. "No marker?" the gravedigger asked. The doctor shook his head. "Later," he said, "when there's time." Back at the refectory, the midwife Agatha had risen and was pacing slowly along the eastern wall. Her steps were even, her back straight, but her eyes were far away. "She's gone," she said when he passed her. "The little one." "Yes," he replied. "She saw them," Agatha whispered. "So do I," he paused. "They move in the corners," she continued. "Not ghosts, not angels, something between. They don't speak, but they're always watching." He gently guided her back to her mat and sat with her for a while. She did not resist. Her breathing was calm. The others were holding on, for now. Clemence, the servant girl, had stabilized. Her fever had broken in the night, and her rash had begun to fade. She was awake, sipping water, her voice hoarse but lucid. "I dreamed of fire," she said softly, "but it didn't burn, it just opened." The doctor made note of it, though he wasn't sure why. Dreams had become a language of their own among the sick. Rule, the lamplighter, was failing. His breaths came ragged, each one a shallow gasp. His limbs had stiffened, and his skin had taken on a yellow pallor. His eyes no longer focused. The doctor tried a tincture of angelica, massaged his chest with mustard oil, but he knew it was only comfort, not cure. By afternoon, a child arrived alone, a boy perhaps 8 years old, leading a younger sister by the hand. She was pale, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fluttering with exhaustion. The boy said his name was Benoit. His sister, Lucette, had been coughing for 2 days. The doctor examined her carefully. No visible swelling, no rash, but the cough was deep and her skin flushed. He admitted them both. The boy refused to leave her side, even when Thomas brought food. He fed her with quiet care, wiping her lips with his own sleeve. He had tied a piece of red thread around her wrist, he explained, so she wouldn't forget who she was if she got too tired. By evening, there were now 10 patients again. The room had changed once more. There was a weight to the air now, not only from fever or incense or breath, but from memory. Elise's empty mat lay untouched. Her candle remained unlit. Her absence had become part of the refectory's rhythm, a silent pulse between every cough, every whispered prayer. The doctor stepped outside before night fully fell. The sky was overcast, the stars hidden, but the moon pushed faintly through the clouds, like a coin beneath silk. He leaned against the outer wall, closed his eyes, and listened to the night. There were no footsteps on the road, no bells from the chapel, no birds in the trees, only the wind and the far-off rustle of leaves falling before their time. He whispered her name once, then returned to his work. The 13th day brought rain, not a gentle mist like the ones that had passed before, but a steady soaking downpour that flattened the grasses, turned roads to streams, and made the town's thatched roofs weep at the edges. The sound filled every corner of the refectory. Drips against the stones, patter on the shuttered windows, and the soft thud of runoff landing in the empty barrels outside. Inside, the world was quieter than usual. Rule, the lamplighter, had died just before sunrise. Thomas had found him during the candle rounds. His breath had ceased, his head slumped to one side. There was no grimace, no sign of struggle, just stillness. The doctor noted that his hands were folded at his chest, though no one remembered doing it. They wrapped him in cloth, washed with wine and rosemary, and Elias came to take him before the town fully stirred. Only 5 hours later, the boy Benoit began to cough. Not the kind of cough that came with a cold wind or a dry throat. This was different, wet, violent, sudden. It tore through the quiet like the toll of a cracked bell. His sister Lucette was still resting. Her fever had broken in the night, and her color was slowly returning. The doctor had even allowed her to sit near the window for a brief moment, wrapped in blankets, so she could feel the breeze and hear the rain. She had smiled, though faintly. But her brother now sat hunched on his mat, arms crossed over his chest, lips pale. When the doctor knelt beside him, Benoit tried to straighten to speak, but a fresh wave of coughing overtook him, flecking his palm with crimson. The doctor reached for the cloth, wiped the boy's hand, and held his gaze. "You're safe," he said softly. "You're with us now." But safety was no longer a promise anyone believed. He prepared a mixture, licorice root, comfrey, a sliver of bark from the white willow tree, and brewed it into a thick, bitter tea. Benoit drank it without protest. He was brave in the way some children are when they understand more than they should. Lucette tried to get up and move to his side, but the doctor stopped her. "For now," he said gently, "you must sit apart." She obeyed reluctantly. By midday, the rain had begun to seep through the roof in small places. Thomas found a leak near the western wall and placed a basin beneath it. Another dripped slowly over the tools. The doctor shifted the table and laid fresh cloth over his supplies. There was something deeply cruel in it, how even the shelter itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of what surrounded them. That afternoon, Agathe began to sing. It was quiet at first, almost a hum, but then grew into something more melodic. A lullaby, perhaps. The words were in a tongue the doctor did not recognize. Her voice wavered, cracked in places, but held. Everyone in the room heard it. Some turned their heads. Lucette watched her with wide eyes. Even Benoit, between coughing fits, paused to listen. When she stopped, she smiled faintly. "No one should leave in silence," she said. The doctor didn't reply, but he recorded her words in the margins of the ledger. Rue, age unknown, deceased. Age 8. Symptoms onset, cough, hemoptysis. Monitored. The ledger now carried more death than recovery. The priest visited in the rain. He stood in the doorway for some time before entering, as though unsure whether to bring his soaked garments into the sacred air of the sick room. Eventually, he stepped inside and sat beside Agathe. He did not ask if anyone had died. He already knew. He held her hand, bowed his head, and murmured prayers. Agathe looked at him, eyes clear for the first time in days, and whispered something back. The doctor couldn't hear. Clemence had improved further. She stood briefly, walked along the wall, helped Thomas with the water basins. Her voice was still rough, but she smiled now occasionally. Each smile was a crack in the gloom, a small, golden fracture. When she passed Benoit's mat, she touched his shoulder and left a small coin in his hand. "For the bells," she said, "if you need them." That night, the doctor finally returned to his home for a short while. It had been nearly 3 days since he last stepped through his own door. The house smelled of ash and herbs long cold. The window shutters were closed, and dust had begun to gather along the sill. He poured water from the basin, rinsed his hands, and sat by the hearth. He did not light it. He simply sat. The silence was almost unbearable. It rang in his ears like the aftermath of thunder. He took out the ledger he had begun for himself, not the one with names and symptoms, but the other, the one filled with reflections, notes, fragments of thought. He opened it to a fresh page. "I fear that I can no longer see where the threshold lies between mercy and despair. Each remedy I offer is a question whispered into fog. The answers come only in the quiet, the breath that doesn't return, the eyes that stop blinking. Yet still I work, still I listen, still I remember." He paused, then added, "Today a child coughed blood into his hand and still smiled at his sister, and I did not cry. I must remember what that means." He closed the book gently. Outside, the rain poured on, steady and endless. He returned to the refectory before the candles burned out. He brought more bandages, fresh sage, and a small jar of quince preserve, something sweet to place on a child's tongue when all else tasted of iron and ash. Lucette was asleep. Benoit was not. He sat beside the boy's mat and whispered a story, not a true one, not a fable either, just something soft and slow and warm. And for a little while, the boy's cough quieted. By the 14th day, the town had entered a rhythm that could no longer be called life, but something close beside it. It moved in cycles of illness and waiting, of muted grief and cautious gratitude. People had stopped asking when it would end. They had begun instead to measure time in different ways, by the rise and fall of fever, by how many candles remained in the drawer, by the number of names whispered before sleep. The rain had ceased sometime in the night. In its place, a low fog clung to the streets and courtyards, thick and slow, softening the edges of buildings and muffling every step. Even the bells of the chapel, when they tolled that morning, sounded distant, their echo swallowed by mist. The doctor was already at the refectory when the first visitor came. It was a man of middle years, wrapped in a thick wool cloak, hood pulled low. He waited at the door, one gloved hand pressed to his chest, the other resting on the hilt of a walking stick. When the doctor opened the door, the man removed his hood. His face was lined not by age, but by something heavier, guilt perhaps, or the memory of too many partings. His beard was neat, his eyes sunken but calm. "I am Leon," he said. "I've brought my wife." The doctor stepped outside and followed him to the cart waiting at the foot of the path. She lay curled beneath a woven blanket, her breath shallow, her eyes flickering open only at intervals. A pale bruise-like rash bloomed across her collarbone. Her name was Isabeau. She was 32. He helped lift her gently, carried her in his arms through the refectory door, and laid her on a fresh mat. Clemence came immediately with a basin of warm water and began wiping the woman's face. Thomas fetched clean cloths and stacked fresh herbs nearby. The doctor offered Leon a chair, but he refused it. "I'll stay with her," the man said, "but I'll stand." So they left him, silent and watchful, as Isabeau drifted into the soft rhythms of fever. At midday, a curious thing happened. Agath, the midwife, stood from her place by the wall and crossed the room, her steps careful but firm. She moved to Benoit, who had grown weaker overnight. His coughing had returned in waves, his eyes ringed with shadow. Lucette sat near him, weaving a crown from dried stalks of rue and tansy. Agathe reached into her sleeve and produced a small vial. "This," she said, "is from my own kit. I kept it long, waiting." The doctor approached but did not stop her. He trusted her hands. She knelt and let a single drop fall onto the boy's tongue. "For sleep," she said, "not the long kind, just enough to rest the lungs." Benoit closed his eyes shortly after. His breathing grew quieter. Lucette placed the half-finished crown beside him and nestled close, eyes on his chest, watching each rise and fall like a heartbeat. That evening, a letter arrived, tied to the leg of a dove, of all things. It landed on the window ledge of the refectory, wings damp from the fog, eyes bright with the clarity only birds ever seem to have anymore. Thomas reached it first, untying the scrap of parchment carefully. It read, "From the west, illness grows, 10 in one day. The priest here has fallen. We beg for tinctures, any instruction. Send help if any remains." There was no name, no signature, only a mark, 3 dots in a line, a symbol used by traveling physicians to indicate urgency without drawing attention. The doctor placed the note beside his ledger. His hands hovered over it for a long time, then fell to his lap. He could not answer it. Not yet. There were too many here already depending on him to speak for the dying. Instead, he returned to his rounds. Isabeau's fever had grown worse. Her breathing was quick, her lips dry and cracked. Leon knelt now, wiping her brow with a handkerchief soaked in thyme water. "I brought her too late," he said, eyes not leaving her face. "She's here now," the doctor replied. "That matters." "You always say that," Leon said. The doctor didn't respond. He only adjusted the mat, lifted Isabeau's head, offered her a few drops of valerian steeped in wine. At the back of the room, Thomas lit a new candle. Its glow added a softness to the far wall, illuminating the damp marks where the rain had once seeped. The air was still thick with herbs, with the faint scent of smoke and pine oil, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt like memory. Clemence sat beside Agathe as night approached. The midwife had grown quiet again, her strength failing. She no longer hummed, but her eyes followed everything. Benoit's rise and fall, Isabeau's shivers, the way Thomas folded linens with quiet, practiced hands. As the doctor passed her, she touched his sleeve. "Don't forget their names," she said, barely a whisper. "I won't," he replied. She nodded once, then let go. That night, he wrote as always. He added to the ledger, "Isabeau, age 32, new arrival, fever, rash. Agathe, still breathing, worsening. Lucid. Benoit, no improvement, Lucette stable." And beneath it, a note in smaller hand. "Even when the healing fails, the tending must not." He sat with that line for a while, candlelight flickering against the window pane. The fog had lifted slightly, just enough to see the chapel bell silhouetted against the moon. It had not rung that day. Perhaps they were waiting. Or perhaps they were listening. The 15th day arrived with a strange stillness. No wind stirred the leaves. No clouds moved across the gray expanse of sky. The town was quiet, not with the silence of night or reverence, but with the kind of hush that descends before a storm, when even birds fall silent and dogs refuse to bark. It was a waiting silence, the kind that weighed on the chest. Inside the refectory, the air was thick with breath and whispers. The doctor moved among the mats with slow precision, checking pulses, refreshing poultices, adjusting damp cloths that had slipped in the night. His hands no longer trembled as they had in the first days. They were steady now, not from certainty, but from exhaustion owned into control. Agathe had not woken. She lay with her face turned toward the window, her breathing shallow, each inhale a thread tugged from deep within. Her skin had gone pale, lips cracked. The whispering dreams she once recited had stilled, and her hands, always once in motion, touching, blessing, measuring, now lay folded gently over her chest. Clemence stayed beside her. She read from a psalter, her voice calm and rhythmic, though she stumbled over some words and whispered others with the reverence of someone who does not understand but believes all the same. Isabeau moaned in her sleep, the fever pulling her deeper. Her husband, Léon, had barely moved from her side. He no longer spoke, only kept a damp cloth in one hand, wringing it slowly between applications, as if the ritual itself was a lifeline. Lucette, bright-eyed and fever-free, had returned to quiet play with her bits of thread and herb stems. She'd finished the crown of rue and tansy and had started another, this one more elaborate, looped through with narrow twine she had plucked from a discarded sack. She said she would make one for every person in the room, even the doctor. Benoit, her brother, had grown worse. His cough had become a rattle, and his sleep was fevered and broken. He muttered now in fragments, calling names that none in the room recognized. At times, he reached into the air as if to catch something just out of sight. The doctor stayed close, applying camphor salve to the boy's chest, laying warm stones at his feet, offering spoonfuls of broth flavored with thyme and bone marrow. But the child refused food, refused water. He was turning inward, like a flame shrinking low before it disappears altogether. In the early afternoon, the chapel bell rang twice. Not the call for prayer, the other one, the bell for death. The sound rolled over the town like distant thunder. The doctor stood still when he heard it, hand frozen above a mortar of crushed angelica. He did not ask who had died. He already knew. Later, Father Gervais arrived. His robe was muddied at the hem, his voice hoarse. He carried no books, no candles, only a small sack tied with leather cord. Inside were bits of bread, dried apples, a twist of salt. For the sick, he said simply. Then he looked toward Agath's mat. He approached her quietly and knelt. He placed 2 fingers against her temple, then her wrist. He bowed his head. She's still with us. The doctor nodded. She always said she would leave on a still day, the priest added, almost to himself. He remained there for some time, whispering what might have been prayers or memories. It was difficult to tell. As evening approached, the doctor found himself standing outside for longer than usual. The air was cold but dry, the ground soft from the recent rains. A mist hovered low above the fields where the graves had been growing in neat rows, each one marked only with a wooden stake or a simple cross. Elias was there, as always. He leaned on his spade, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirtied sleeve. "She'll go tonight," he said. The doctor didn't ask who. Elias didn't specify. Inside, the light from the high windows began to fade. Thomas moved among the mats, lighting the lamps one by one. Clemence helped with the herbs, crushing dried lavender and lemon balm into cloth pouches that she hung above each sickbed. Lucette placed her second crown beside Agath's pillow. "It's not perfect," she whispered, "but it smells nice." That night, the doctor sat near the center of the room where he could watch each patient without turning his head. His journal lay open on his lap, though he wrote little. He looked at Benoit. The boy's chest rose and fell like distant waves, uncertain and fading. He looked at Isabeau. Her fever continued, but her hands had stopped trembling. He looked at Agathe. Her breathing was still light, but it was there. A single leaf holding to the branch before the frost. In his journal, the doctor wrote, 15 days. Each dawn now feels like a verdict, each sunset a sigh. I no longer ask if it is enough. I only ask if it is remembered. Today a girl made a garland for the dying. Today a man knelt beside his wife and did not cry. Today the wind did not move, but we did. Quietly, we did. He closed the book. The night crept in, and the room held its breath. The 16th day broke with no fanfare, no bell, no change in the wind, only a pale sliver of sun slipping between low clouds, painting the rooftops in dull silver before vanishing again. The doctor was already awake. He had not slept at all. He sat by Agath's side, her breath so faint that he had to hold a mirror to her lips just to be sure it still fogged. It did, but barely. Lucette had woken before the others, padding softly across the refectory's stone floor in bare feet. A half-finished garland cradled in her arms. She set it near Agath's feet and whispered, "One more for her dreams." Then she returned to her place beside Benoit, who had grown too weak to speak. His skin was sallow, his cough now dry and shallow. He no longer opened his eyes, but he held his sister's hand. That much remained. The doctor made his rounds in silence, each step measured, deliberate. The walls of the refectory seemed to hold their own breath. Even the flickering of the lamps was subdued, their flames low and steady, as if even the fire had learned reverence. Clemence was the only one to speak that morning. "He won't last the day," she said, nodding toward the boy. The doctor didn't correct her. He knew. She helped him steep a fresh infusion, thyme, yarrow, a pinch of dried violets, not to cure, to ease. She dabbed it on Benoit's lips with a strip of linen. Isabeau, despite her fever, began to stir. Her husband Leon murmured softly to her, brushing her hair away from her damp brow. When her eyes opened, she whispered something inaudible. He leaned closer. She said it again, and this time he nodded. She wants music, he told the doctor. A song. There was no music to be had in the refectory, no instruments, no minstrels left to roam the town. But Clemence, hearing, stepped forward. She sang, a slow, plain melody. Old, no words, just a thread of sound that rose and dipped gently, like the tide coming in over the edge of sleep. The doctor felt it too, how the sound softened the air, rounded the sharpness of silence, made space even for sorrow. Leon closed his eyes, hand on his wife's shoulder. Thomas paused mid-task, his hands resting on the edge of a basin. Lucette hummed along. Even Benoit, though unmoving, seemed to breathe more slowly, more peacefully. As the melody faded, the priest arrived. Father Gervais looked older than before. His shoulders stooped. His hair, once dark, had gone pale at the temples. His fingers trembled as he made the sign of the cross. He went first to Agathe, then to the boy. Then, for the first time, he approached the doctor. "You've borne this too long without rest," he said. "I'll rest when they do," the doctor replied. The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. "And if they never do?" The doctor said nothing. Instead, he knelt beside Benoit and whispered, "You are loved. You are remembered. You are not alone." Then he rose and moved to his desk. The ledger waited. He opened it slowly, the binding soft and worn from use. He recorded Isabeau's slow improvement, a slight reduction in fever, coherent words. He recorded Agathe's continued breath, though her pulse had grown thin. And then he wrote Benoit's name again. Benoit, breathing shallow, unresponsive. Lucette present, final comfort measures only. As he closed the book, a breeze moved through the room, soft, almost imperceptible. It stirred the edge of a cloth, lifted a strand of Lucette's hair, flickered the flame of the smallest candle, and Agathe exhaled. It was not a gasp, not a cry, just one long breath that did not return. The doctor stood. He did not rush. He did not call out. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, fingers light against her wrist, then her throat. He waited a full minute before nodding. Clemence crossed herself. Thomas lowered his head. Lucette rose quietly, lifted the garland she had made, and laid it across Agathe's chest. "I told her I would," she whispered. The priest came forward. He said the prayers. They wrapped Agathe in the cleanest cloth they had. The doctor added drops of lavender oil to her shroud. They carried her out together, doctor, priest, gravedigger, and girl, and laid her gently into the cart. Elias paused longer than usual before departing. "She delivered half the town," he said softly. "I know," the doctor replied. When they returned, Benoit had stopped coughing. He slept, or seemed to, his breath barely there. Lucette had taken his hand again. She did not cry. "She's with him now," she said. The doctor didn't know if she meant Agathe or someone else. That night, the doctor did not write in the ledger. Instead, he sat at the foot of the boy's mat, lit a candle, and whispered to no one in particular. A story about stars, about wind, about a boat that never sank, about sleep, and the candle burned down and the shadows held still, and the breath of the refectory grew quiet once more. The 17th day began not with a cry or a knock, but with stillness so profound it felt like the world had forgotten to turn. The fog that had lifted the day before had returned in the night, thicker, heavier, clinging low to the earth like a wet blanket laid across the rooftops, the fields, the very air. Inside the refectory, the silence was nearly total. Only the soft sound of a single child's breath broke it. Lucette, curled beside her brother's mat, her hands tucked beneath her chin, slept deeply for the first time in days. Benoit did not. He was still. The doctor was already awake. He had not closed his eyes at all. He had remained at the boy's side through the long night, watching the shallow rhythm of Benoit's chest until, sometime in the darkest hour before dawn, that rhythm faded, like a ripple disappearing into still water. There had been no final gasp, no stiffening of limbs, only the soft closing of a door that would not open again. When Lucette woke, she knew. She didn't ask, didn't touch his hand, didn't weep. She sat up, looked at the doctor, and nodded once, solemnly. "I think he's with Mama now," she said, her voice small. The doctor placed a hand over hers. "I think so too." Together, they washed his face, combed his hair, and wrapped him in the softest cloth the doctor had left, one he had once meant to keep for the next infant born in the village. He used it now, without hesitation. Lucette laid the last of her garlands on her brother's chest. It had been unfinished, but she completed it quietly, using 2 pieces of thread she pulled from her own hem. When Elias arrived with the cart, he said nothing at all. He only removed his hat, pressed it to his chest, and nodded once to the doctor, once to Lucette, and once to the boy beneath the linen. Then he lifted the small body into the cart and wheeled it away through the fog. The girl did not cry until the sound of the wheels vanished entirely. Then she cried in silence, her face pressed against the doctor's side, her hands gripping the folds of his robe. The day moved forward because it had to. Isabeau opened her eyes again mid-morning. Her breath had steadied during the night, and though her strength was not yet returning, her clarity had. She asked for broth. She asked if the doctor had slept. She asked what day it was. Her husband wept softly at her side, clutching her hand as if afraid the breath would vanish again if he loosened his grip. "Let her rest," the doctor said gently. "She asked to hear the story again," Leon whispered. "The one with the tower and the birds." The doctor didn't know the story, but Lucette did. She sat at Isabeau's side and told it in pieces, her voice still hoarse but steadier now. She spoke of birds who flew so high they could no longer see the earth, of a tower built of feathers and light, of a queen who waited 100 years to come down again. Isabeau smiled. That afternoon, a courier came from the town hall. The bailiff's seal was stamped in red wax on the folded parchment. The doctor opened it beneath the olive tree just outside the refectory door, breathing in the cool air before reading. The sickness appears contained to the east and south quarters. Reports from outer farms show no signs of spread, restrictions to remain. Markets will stay closed, all town bells to remain silent until deemed safe. Priests instructed to continue rites without gathering. Physicians to be provided with increased stores of dry goods and alcohol. Continue your work. You are not forgotten. He read the last line twice. You are not forgotten. The irony of it struck him. It was not for him, not really. It was for the idea of him, for the shape of a physician moving from bed to bed, for the role. But roles did not bury children. Still, he folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the satchel with the others. Inside, the day moved slowly. Clemence continued her rounds now, acting more and more like an apprentice. She had taken to reading pulses, preparing tinctures under guidance, and even sitting with the dying in the way the doctor once had. Her hands were sure. Her heart was steady. She could be more than this, Thomas said once, watching her. She already is, the doctor replied. By evening, the refectory was nearly full again, not with the dying, but with breath. Isabeau whispered a prayer with her husband. Lucette lay down at last, wrapped in the doctor's own cloak. Clemence wrote in the margins of the ledger, carefully tracing each name with fresh ink. Agath had been buried at dusk. The doctor had not gone to the burial. He had stood at the window and watched the small procession wend its way through the fog. The priest, the gravedigger, 2 midwives from the southern road who had known her in younger days. They carried wildflowers tied in strips of linen. She would not be alone in the earth. That night, the doctor sat with Thomas beside the window. They did not speak. They passed a small jar of preserved cherries between them, saved for winter. They each took one. They did not savor it. They only acknowledged it. And later, the doctor returned to the ledger. He wrote, Benoit, age 8, died before dawn, sister present, peaceful. Then paused. Below that, he wrote something else. We do not save everyone, but we remember them, and sometimes that is what saves us. He closed the book, and for the first time in 17 days, he allowed himself to sleep. Not seated, not half dreaming, but fully, on a cot near the door, beneath a heavy blanket, while the wind passed over the roof and the world outside breathed in quiet harmony. The 18th day brought light. Not warmth, not yet, but light clear enough to stretch through the tall windows of the refectory and touch the stone floor with something almost golden. The rain had ended. The fog had lifted. And for the first time in many days, a sliver of blue sky appeared like a miracle behind the thinning clouds. It was Thomas who noticed it first. He was carrying a basin of clean water toward the hearth when he stopped, his shadow falling across the floor in sharp relief. He looked up, then turned slowly and whispered, "Son." The doctor stirred at the threshold of waking. His body, unfamiliar with rest, resisted the pull of morning. But the light had found him too, stretched across the blanket like a gentle hand. He opened his eyes. It took a moment for the weight of the world to settle back over him, the faces, the names, the empty mats. But then he sat up, boots touching the floor for the first time without pain. He breathed in deeply. The air no longer tasted of vinegar and fever. It smelled of dust, of earth, of the faintest trace of rosemary drifting from the windowsill. He stood, stretched, and walked the length of the room. Clemence was already awake, grinding dried mint with her mortar, her sleeves rolled. She looked up, offered a faint smile, then nodded toward Isabeau. She ate a full bowl this morning, spoke her husband's name, slept again. The doctor crossed the room and saw it for himself. Isabeau lay with her arms folded across her chest, not in death but in comfort. Her breathing was regular. Her color was returning. Leon had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his face softened, his hands no longer clenched. Lucette was still asleep on a pallet of her own now. Clemence had insisted she have her own space after Benoit's burial. The girl had fought the change, wept even. But now she slept without stirring, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the other loosely gripping a bundle of dried chamomile. The doctor made his rounds as he always did, but the ritual felt different now. Not lighter, never that. But less like dragging a cart through mud, more like carrying something fragile across a stream. There were only 4 patients in the room that morning, and none were dying. Thomas stood at the doorway, polishing the handles of the water buckets with a scrap of linen. He looked older somehow, not in his face, but in his posture, in the way he moved, no longer the soft uncertainty of youth, but the quiet, tired confidence of someone who had seen too much too quickly and chosen to keep going anyway. He approached the doctor, reached into his cloak, and handed him a folded paper. A man came before dawn, he said. Didn't give a name, said to give this to you and only you. The doctor opened it. The writing was hurried, smudged in places, a list of symptoms, a village's name, a number, 11, then 13, then 17, a plea. He folded it again. It's to the west, he said quietly. 3 days by cart. Will you go? Thomas asked. The doctor looked around the room. Clemence now sat by the hearth, trimming dried roots with a small blade. Isabeau had turned in her sleep, murmuring something gentle. Lucette stirred but did not wake. The room was calm. For the first time in weeks, it held more life than death. I might, the doctor said, but not today. That afternoon, he and Thomas opened the shutters for the first time in over a week. The light poured in, cool and bright and unfamiliar. Dust danced in it. The corners of the refectory, long cloaked in shadow, were finally revealed. The walls were streaked with old soot. The stone floor was uneven in places. It was not beautiful, but it was theirs. Lucette helped sweep. She insisted on it. Clemence prepared a new blend of herbs to hang in fresh cloth near the windows. Rosemary, lavender, a touch of orange peel saved from a dried fruit sent by a merchant weeks ago. The scent filled the room. They buried no one that day. Elias came by anyway, leaning on his cart, eating an apple. Quiet, he said, glancing through the doorway. For now, the doctor replied. Elias nodded. That's something. And he turned, whistling softly, and walked back toward the fields. Later, the priest came and brought with him a loaf of warm bread, still fragrant. He laid it on the table and simply said, I didn't know who else might have some. They shared it. Doctor, priest, Thomas, Clemence, and Lucette, who was given 2 slices and a cup of watered wine. The warmth of it lingered. When night fell, no bells rang. No bodies were carried. No names were added to the ledger. Instead, the doctor opened the book and wrote a single line. Today they lived. He closed it. And for the first time since the plague arrived, he did not dream of sickness. He dreamed of the sound of sweeping, of bread torn in silence, of light slanting across a wall, of something returning, quietly, steadily, almost like hope. The 19th day unfolded like a sigh, not the sharp, aching kind that followed loss, nor the breathless one of fear returning, but the kind that slipped gently from the lungs when one sat down after a long walk, hands sore, eyes heavy, but still intact. It was the sound of a town beginning to remember itself. There was still no music, no laughter in the streets, but the silence was different, lighter. The oppressive weight had lifted, if only slightly, and in its place was something thinner, more bearable, an ache instead of a wound. The refectory reflected it too. No new patients arrived that morning. No knocks at the door. No weeping on the threshold. The 4 mats remained occupied. Isabeau, who now sat up and drank honeyed water without aid. Lucette, who had begun drawing tiny pictures in the dust on the floor with a piece of burnt twig. Clemence, who moved with quiet authority, her apron stained with elderberry juice and vinegar. And Thomas, who no longer asked what to do, but simply did. The doctor woke just after dawn and watched them in stillness before rising. It had become a ritual, his observation before motion, his quiet study of life before stepping once again into its currents. He walked to the large window and opened it fully. The cold air poured in, bracing and clean. Outside, the sky was streaked in soft gray and peach. The wind stirred the branches of the elm near the burial field. It smelled of damp leaves, old wood, and something else. Earth. The kind of scent that only came after a long rain, when the soil had been soaked and was beginning to breathe again. He stood there for some time, letting the air touch his face, clearing the scent of dried herbs and candle smoke from his lungs. Behind him, Clemence approached and offered a small cup. "Rosehip and hawthorn," she said. "For the heart." He took it, nodding in thanks, and drank. It was bitter, but warm, grounding. Later in the morning, a boy came with a letter, his cheeks pink from cold, a satchel slung over his shoulder. He stood at the door, shifting on his feet, waiting. The doctor stepped out to meet him. "From the magistrate," the boy said, holding out the folded parchment with a kind of awkward reverence. The doctor opened it and read quickly. It was a request, not an order, for a written report. They wanted an account, names, numbers, duration, evidence of containment. They wanted it recorded, made official. He folded the letter and placed it inside his satchel. "I'll write it," he told the boy. The boy nodded, then hesitated. "Is it true," he asked, "that you touched all the dead with your hands?" The doctor looked at him for a moment, then replied, "Not all, but enough." The boy did not know how to respond, so he nodded again, turned, and jogged back toward the square. That afternoon, the doctor began to write the report. Not in the ledger, not in his journal, but on a fresh sheaf of parchment, its edges trimmed straight, the ink thick and slow. He began with the first day, the traveler in the inn, coughing blood. He named the second, the washerwoman, the monk. Then Elise, then Benoit. He listed the fevers, the signs, the treatments administered. He noted the failed remedies and those that brought brief comfort. He named each burial, each helper, each kindness. And when he reached the 15th day, he paused. There was a line he could not write. Not yet. The day the breath returned to the room, not just the breath of the ill, but of the space itself. He turned to his journal instead. There, he wrote, "The illness wanes. It does not vanish. It sleeps. Somewhere beyond the gates it waits again. But today I saw the girl draw a bird in the ash beside her mat. I saw the man kiss his wife's hand. I saw the novice boy light a lamp before sunset. Not out of fear, but because the dark was coming, and he wanted the room to glow before it did." He set down the quill. Outside, near the chapel, bells rang once, just once. Not for death, not for warning, but for mass. A signal to the town that prayer, like life, was not forbidden anymore. Lucette, who stood by the window, turned at the sound. "They're ringing," she said, smiling. "He'll hear it wherever he is." The doctor nodded. They ate warm bread and broth that evening. Thomas found a wheel of goat cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, buried beneath a crate of dried roots. They shared it, slowly, reverently, as if it were gold. Before night, the doctor visited each mat. Isabeau, breathing steady. Lucette drawing stars now with white chalk given by Clemence. Clemence herself reading a worn page from Avicenna, lips moving in a whisper. Thomas cleaning the tools, humming softly to himself an old tune that had no words. The doctor sat at his desk, opened the ledger, and wrote no names. Instead, he added, "There were no deaths today. There may be more to come, but today there were none, and that in this place is everything." Then he stood, extinguished the candle by his side, and walked to the threshold of the refectory. He looked out at the town. A single window across the square glowed with firelight. Smoke rose from chimneys, and somewhere far off, a child laughed. The doctor stood very still, hands folded, as if holding something invisible. Not grief, not pain, but the fragile shape of a beginning. The 20th day began with footsteps. Soft ones, uncertain, muffled by the thawing earth and the brittle hush of early morning. They came not from the direction of the square or the chapel, but from the field path, the one that curved around the orchard, past the old well where children once played. The doctor heard them as he opened the shutters, just as the first blush of sun reached the far ridge and slipped across the roofs like gold poured from a quiet hand. He leaned out the window. 3 figures approached, a man tall and hunched from travel, a woman her skirts caked in road dust, one arm wrapped tightly around a bundle, and behind them a boy of perhaps 12, thin and pale, but upright. They did not cry out. They simply came to the refectory door and stood. The doctor opened it before they could knock. "Please," the woman said. "We heard." This place was still open. He looked at them. The man was gaunt but not fevered. The woman's lips were cracked, her breath short, but her skin was clear. The boy, he was quiet. His eyes, wide and sunken, darted once toward the straw-littered floor behind the doctor, then downward. The doctor stepped aside. "Come in." They entered without ceremony. The woman clutched the bundle to her chest. It shifted gently, and from within came a small whimper, a baby wrapped in wool no more than a few weeks old. "We left the village to the west," the man explained, sitting slowly on the edge of the bench near the hearth. "Our priest was the first to die, then the steward, then many. We kept walking. We heard you'd held the sickness here, that some had lived." The doctor poured water, set bread near the fire to warm. Clemence approached and took the child gently from the woman's arms. "He's hungry," she said. "I haven't had milk in days," the mother whispered. Lucette, still sleepy, rose from her mat and went to fetch the last of the goat cheese. Thomas offered broth in a tin cup, placed it in the boy's hands. They did not ask questions, not about who had died, not about what the family had left behind. They simply made space. By mid-morning, the refectory felt different again, not because of fever or fear, but because of breath, new life. The doctor examined the infant carefully. No swelling, no lesions, a small wheeze in the chest, but no crackle, likely cold from the long walk, not illness. He wrapped the child again and handed him back. "You came in time," the woman nodded, eyes full. The boy, Henry, he said his name was, ate slowly, watching everything. Thomas sat beside him and showed him how to hold the cup without spilling. Later, he offered him a smooth stone taken from the riverbank, one side worn flat. Henry ran his thumb over it again and again, like it was something holy. That afternoon, a pigeon arrived. It landed near the ledge, bearing no note, no message. But it was the same one. They knew by the crooked feather along its wing. The same bird that had carried the plea from the western village days before. The doctor stood at the window and stared at it. The pigeon blinked once, then took flight again. He followed its path until it vanished behind the rooftops. Later, as he walked through the town to collect more linens from the chapel storeroom, he saw them. 2 children kicking a ball of bundled rags through the square. Their laughter rang like bells. A woman sweeping her doorstep, a man repairing a cartwheel. He passed them quietly. They nodded, not deeply, just enough. At the chapel steps, Father Gervais stood speaking with an older couple. He caught the doctor's eye and gave a short, tired smile. They did not speak. There was no need. The storeroom was colder than he remembered, dusty, stale, but filled with untouched bundles of cloth, pots of balm, 2 sealed jars of lard. He packed what he could and returned along the same path. The sun hung low by the time he reached the refectory again. Inside, the room was warm, almost lively. Clemence boiled water for washing. Lucette taught Henri how to braid stems of mint. Isabeau, still weak, sat propped with pillows, her eyes clear, her voice soft but steady as she told a story of her childhood, a story with wolves and snow and a coat made of silver thread. Leon carved a spoon from a scrap of cherry wood, and in the corner the woman with the baby rocked him gently, eyes half closed, as if trying to remember how to feel safe. The doctor stood at the door and took it all in. No bells, no cries, no weeping, only life, reassembling itself piece by fragile piece. He moved to his desk, opened the ledger, and wrote new arrivals. Jean, Sabine, Henry, and child, name unspoken. No fever, no symptoms, refugees from the western route, admitted. Then he turned to his personal journal. He paused, then wrote, "Today a child arrived in silence, and the room welcomed him not as a patient, but as a guest." He folded the page and set down the quill. Outside, the air turned colder. Inside, the lamps glowed, the baby stirred, and no one said a word about death. The 21st day began with the soft sound of sweeping. It was still early enough that the stars hadn't yet surrendered their hold on the sky, and the morning light was only a promise tucked behind the hills. But inside the refectory, the world was already moving. Quietly, intentionally, with care. Clemence stood near the eastern wall, broom in hand, gathering the dried petals that had fallen overnight from the herbs strung above the doorways. She moved slowly, her motions deliberate, as if trying not to wake the old stones beneath her feet. Thomas was already boiling water near the hearth, wrapping bundles of linen for washing. The warmth of the fire curled up the walls, sending shadows dancing in gentle shapes. The doctor sat by the open ledger. He had not written a name in 2 days. Not a death, not a worsening. Only small notes in the margins. Isabeau stood today, and Henry laughed when Thomas slipped on the spilled water. And Lucette now says she wants to become a doctor when she grows up. The mat where Benoit had lain was empty still, untouched, but no longer draped in grief. Lucette had placed a small stone tower there, a collection of pebbles stacked in gentle balance, a kind of monument, a game, both at once. That morning, the door creaked open without warning. The wind stirred through the room as the priest entered, bringing with him the cold scent of pine and wax. He carried a bundle wrapped in blue cloth and nodded as he stepped inside. "I thought," he said, "that the time had come for a gift." He unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay an old book, worn, leather-bound, the edges of its pages stained with age and use. Its spine was cracked in 2 places, its binding reinforced with thread, but it was whole. The doctor recognized it. Herbarium Medicorum, written in Latin, copied by hand, decades ago. "I've had it in the sacristy for years," Father Gervais said, "too fragile to lend, but I think it belongs here now." The doctor took the book as if accepting a sleeping infant. He opened it slowly, the parchment soft under his fingers. Diagrams of plants, entries scrawled in tiny script, angelica, wormwood, valerian. Notes in the margins, some written by hands long vanished, others by the priest himself. "Thank you," he said. The priest only nodded and moved to sit beside Isabeau, who was now walking short distances, leaning on her husband's arm. She smiled at him. "I remember that book," she said. "I once thought to study it myself, but life had other plans." "Life always has other plans," the priest replied. Henri spent much of the morning outside, sitting on the threshold with Thomas, who taught him how to carve soap with a bone-handled knife. It was a trick for calming nerves, for focusing fingers that trembled. Lucette watched, then disappeared briefly and returned with a small bundle wrapped in cloth, her own treasures, a scrap of ribbon, a stone shaped like a heart, and a thimble with a dent in its side. She offered one to Henri. He chose the ribbon. In the quiet that followed, the doctor prepared tinctures. He did not need them, not yet, but he brewed them all the same. Mint and yarrow, angelica and honey, chamomile steeped in warm wine. He lined them up in rows, not for emergency, but for readiness. Readiness was now a form of hope. At midday, Clemence brought him a small bowl of broth. "You must eat," she said. He took without protest. She sat beside him while he ate, watching the sunlight drift across the windowsill. "I used to think doctors were supposed to be silent," she said. "Some are." "You're not." "Not always," he replied. "Good," she said. "The silence is heavy enough without your help." They shared a smile. It felt like an old one, something buried and uncovered. That evening, before the lamps were lit, the doctor opened the herbarium. He placed it on the center table where the light from the fire could touch its pages. He turned to a section marked by a faded ribbon and found an entry on feverfew, complete with a delicate illustration, a plant drawn in confident strokes, petals outstretched. He ran his finger beneath the words, "For the calming of the heat in the mind and body alike." He closed the book. The room had grown dim. He looked around and saw them all, alive, breathing, occupied with small acts of care. Thomas sorting cloths, Lucette humming to herself as she spun thread, Henri drawing lines in the dust, Isabeau cradling her child, speaking softly to no one, Clemence sitting near the hearth, eyes closed but not asleep, and the priest standing near the door, hands folded, as if guarding the threshold not from death but from forgetting. The doctor lit one lamp, then another, then a third, not because they needed more light, but because the living had gathered and light was what they deserved. Later, in the stillness of the night, he wrote in his journal, "The sick have not returned, the dead do not knock. Today the world sat with me, not in mourning but in memory, and memory in the end may be the gentlest cure we have." He closed the book, then stood and watched the lamp beside the sleeping child. It burned quietly, no flicker, no struggle, just steady golden light. The 22nd day arrived without event. Not uneventful, only without the urgency that had once defined each sunrise. The kind of morning that moved like honey, slow, golden, unhurried. A fog hung low above the rooftops again, but it did not carry fear anymore. It was just the breath of the earth after a cold night. Nothing more. Inside the refectory, the rhythm of the new day had already begun. Thomas was stoking the fire, its gentle crackle the first sound to greet the dawn. Lucette slept curled in a blanket near the window, her feet tucked beneath her like a cat. Henri had taken to waking early now and sat cross-legged near the hearth, carving patterns into a sliver of pine. The scent of the wood mixed with smoke and herbs. The doctor stood by the door, watching the light change. He didn't rush to open the ledger. He didn't need to. There were no new patients, no bodies waiting to be tended, no letters tied to the legs of pigeons. The stillness was not absence now, it was rest. A long inhale before life began to move again. After breakfast, simple bread, warm milk, a sliver of dried pear, Clemence approached the doctor with a folded piece of cloth. "I've mended your cloak," she said. He took it gently. The rip near the shoulder had been stitched clean, the fraying hem reinforced. It no longer smelled of smoke, but of rosemary and something soft, lavender perhaps, or soap. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. She nodded and returned to her work. Later in the morning, they opened the doors fully for the first time. Not just the shutters. The great wooden doors, swollen from the rain, creaked and groaned on their hinges. The sunlight poured in like an old friend long absent. The children blinked against the brightness, but did not look away. Thomas swept the threshold clean, scattering dust and old straw into the street. The doctor stepped outside and stood beneath the eaves, the sun warm on his face. There in the quiet came a voice. "Is this where they live?" He turned. A young man stood a few paces away, clothes patched, boots dusty, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. He looked like a traveler, though not aimless. His eyes were sharp, familiar. "I was told," the man continued, "that the plague came here, but the place still breathes." "It does," the doctor replied. The young man stepped forward. "I studied in Cannes, left when the fever reached the gates. I've been traveling ever since, helping where I could." He looked at the refectory. "Is there space?" The doctor studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "There's always space." The young man entered quietly, removing his cloak as he crossed the threshold. He placed his satchel near the long table and approached the ledger. He didn't touch it, just looked. "Do you still keep names?" "We do." "And the living?" "Their names too." He smiled faintly. "Good." They spoke for some time. The young man's name was Remy. He had once studied under a surgeon in Rouen, had seen plague in 3 towns already. He carried his own tools, small, careful, wrapped in oiled cloth. He had lost a sister and a teacher, but he still chose to travel. "Why come here?" the doctor asked. Remy looked around the room, saw the mended robes, the children braiding cord, the fire, the herbs, the neat row of empty mats now folded and stored. "Because someone said this place remembers." The doctor said nothing, but he placed a chair near the table and gestured for Remy to sit. That afternoon, they read together from the Herbarium Medicorum. The old Latin rolled softly from the pages, names of plants spoken like prayers. Lucette sat nearby and copied drawings onto scrap parchment with a bit of charcoal. Thomas sharpened quills. Clemence brewed nettle tea for Isabeau, who now walked without leaning. Henri dozed in the sunlight. And the baby, still unnamed, still small, slept in his mother's arms with a peace that made even the priest pause when he passed through. Toward evening, the doctor finally returned to the ledger. He wrote, "Remy, physician, arrived seeking to tend, not to be tended, accepted." Then below it, "We are not healed, but we are healing, and now the hands that lift the sick are not mine alone." He closed the book and stepped outside once more. The sun was low. A thin trail of smoke rose from a chimney across the square. Someone was baking again. Children's voices echoed faintly down the street. and above the chapel, a pair of birds landed on the steeple and sat, still, together. The 23rd day began with sound, not loud, not jarring, but layered, familiar. There was the scrape of broom on stone as Thomas began the morning sweep, the bubbling of water near the hearth where Clemence boiled dried nettles and lemon peel, the soft murmur of Lucette speaking to the baby in a language only the two of them seemed to understand. Outside, birds, not just one or two, a whole cluster of them calling from the rooftops and chimneys as if to announce with quiet joy that the season was turning. And beneath it all, a rhythm, Remy sharpening his blades. The sound was steady, soft. Each stroke against the whetstone carried with it a kind of reverence, not preparation for surgery or urgency, but ritual. He sat near the light, using the flat of the stone to smooth each edge until it gleamed. The doctor watched him for a while before speaking. "You're methodical," he said. Remy looked up. "I try to be." "Who taught you?" Remy paused. "A man named Ferrand. He kept a shop in Rouen. He was never rushed. Said the hands must be quieter than the illness, or the patient will only feel the fear." The doctor nodded. Ferrand? He had heard the name once, long ago. After breakfast, they moved through the refectory together, checking pulse and breath, inspecting minor bruises, tending to the aches that came not from illness, but from survival. They spoke little, but the rhythm between them was clean, unspoken. Remy moved like someone who had been in many rooms like this one, though perhaps none quite so still. Henri had taken to following them now, carrying small bowls, relighting the lamps when they flickered. He asked questions in a whisper. "What does that tincture do? Why do you look at the tongue? What's the difference between pain and fever?" The doctor answered when he could. When he could not, he said only, "Watch." And Henry did. That afternoon, the doors opened again, this time not to the sick, but to the curious. Two older women from the southern quarter stepped inside, wrapped in heavy cloaks. They brought a basket, dried apples, a wheel of cheese, and a scrap of beeswax, and placed it on the long table. "We heard you were still here," one said. "We thought you might need this." The doctor bowed his thanks. They stayed for a while, sitting near the window. They did not speak much, only listened. One of them wept a little, quietly, when Lucette offered her a sprig of mint. They left before sunset. Just before evening, the first letter arrived. Not by pigeon this time, but by hand. A boy on a mule, wrapped in a scarf too long for him, bearing a folded page sealed in red wax. The doctor took it with care and read beneath the lamp. "We request counsel and supplies. Illness has reached the edge of the lowlands, though not yet in full. We have seen fever and fatigue, but no swelling. Still, we remember the silence before the wave. If you can come, come. If you cannot, write. Your name is known, and your survival is felt by those who haven't yet begun theirs." The doctor folded the paper slowly. He passed it to Remy. Remy read it once, then again, then looked up and said simply, "I'll go." "You've just arrived," the doctor replied. "Then my hands are rested." The decision was made that quickly. Thomas fetched the traveling satchel from the storeroom. Clemence filled it with dried herbs, bundles of cloth, 2 jars of oil, and a packet of dried rose hips. The doctor added his own notes, careful measurements, cautions, small diagrams from the herbarium, tucked into a leather folio. Lucette gave Remy her best ribbon. "For marking the houses," she said. He tied it around the satchel strap. Henri asked, "Will you come back?" Remy paused, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "If the road allows," he said. And with that, he left before nightfall, mule hooves soft against the dusting of leaves that had gathered along the path. They watched him disappear into the haze of the road until even the red of the ribbon could no longer be seen. That night, the doctor stood at the long table, running his fingers across the leather cover of the herbarium. Then he sat and wrote. Remy departed on the 23rd day. He carried with him everything we could give. The illness travels, and now so does the memory of what we've learned. This place will hold its silence. He will carry its voice. He closed the book. The fire burned low, and somewhere out beyond the hills, the road stretched on, steady, quiet, awaiting its next footsteps. The 24th day came like a breath released. The light entered first, slow and golden, stretching across the stone floor as if it too had waited long enough. It touched the legs of the long table, the ridges of the mortar bowl, the corners where dust had gathered during weeks of grief. It made no announcement. It just arrived, unshivering and warm. The doctor stood alone at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the town unfold beneath the light. Children were already in the street, their laughter high and unguarded, weaving between carts and buckets in the cautious rhythm of adults returning to the day. A woman hung damp linen from a line across her window. A man patched the wheel of a barrow. A rooster crowed, late, uncertain, but proud. Life had not returned. It had stayed, quietly, stubbornly, in spite of everything. Inside, the refectory had shifted once more. It no longer felt like a ward or a hospice. It felt like a home again. Not for one family, but for something shared, like a lantern passed from hand to hand in the dark. Clemence sorted the dried herbs into jars, humming tunelessly. Thomas swept as always, but today he whistled while he did it. Henri was teaching Lucette how to tie a sling using strips of cloth, and the girl, to everyone's astonishment, listened without interrupting. Isabeau sat beside the fire, the baby in her arms. The child had a name now, Julien. He cooed at the warmth and the shadows on the walls, and the weight of his breath filled the space like incense. The doctor moved among them slowly, without purpose. He touched shoulders, adjusted a jar, smiled. No one asked him what came next. No one needed to. By midday, visitors had come. Not sick, not frightened, but curious. A mason's apprentice with cracked hands offered help patching the outer wall. A baker's wife delivered 2 loaves of rye, wrapped in cloth. A girl no older than 10 recited a poem about rain, her voice trembling, her cheeks pink with pride. Father Gervais came with a scroll, an official notice from the magistrate. The town was to reopen its schoolhouse the following week. The market, cautiously, 2 days later. And the bells, silent for weeks, would ring again on the next Sabbath. The priest left the scroll on the table and sat without speaking. His robes were cleaner now, his face less hollow. He carried a book in his lap, but he did not open it. He just listened, to the sounds, to the quiet, to the living. That afternoon, Lucette brought the doctor a gift. It was not wrapped. It was not new. It was a single white feather tucked into the spine of his journal. For remembering, she said. He did not ask where it came from. He only tucked it deeper into the fold and nodded once. Then he opened the journal for the last time. His hands moved slowly over the page, each stroke of ink deliberate, careful, silent. There was no ceremony to it, no speech, just the kind of stillness that grows around truth when truth is finally spoken. He wrote, "Today no one came to be healed. They came to help, to give, to witness. Today we did not survive. We lived, we braided hair, we shared bread, we repaired stone. The plague is past, but something else remains." Then he added, "Let this record hold it." He set the pen down, closed the book, and breathed. Outside, dusk was beginning to settle. The light had changed again, slanting lower, softer now. The elm tree in the burial field swayed in the breeze. The crows were gone. The pigeons had returned. A single bell rang from the chapel tower, not for mourning nor warning, just one note, clear, round, certain. The doctor stood once more at the threshold, the light behind him, the town before him, and nothing in his hands but time. He did not speak. He did not write up. He simply watched the day end and let it.